Chapter 1375 Beginning the Accommodation Thud. The doors of Backlund, Trier, Lemberg, and St. Millum opened and closed at the same time without a breeze. Inside a white tower in the headquarters of the god of knowledge and wisdom, Luca, who was on duty underground, sensed that something was amiss and stood up abruptly. As a prophet, he acutely sensed that something was happening. The elder in a brass-threaded, white robe immediately used a mystical technique and arrived at the entrance of the underground area. He pushed the door open. However, the door that wasn't considered heavy to a demigod didn't budge, as though it was sealed by an invisible force. Luca Brewster didn't attempt to forcibly open it as he cast his gaze deep underground. There was silence. There was no sound. This isn't normal. Luca didn't need to rely on his beyonder powers to determine the problem here. Usually, in the deepest part of the ground, there would always be sounds that made people's hair stand on end. But now, it was as if it had disappeared, as though it never existed. Others might not know, but as a high-ranking member of the Church of Knowledge, Luca knew that the voice came from an extremely terrifying sealed artifact that even he didn't know the exact details of, so it was impossible for it to be erased out of thin air. The current situation could only mean one thing: either the sealed artifact had already escaped the restrictions and entered a more bizarre state, or it had been sealed further, preventing it from affecting the outside world. Regardless of the possibility, it meant that there was extreme danger lurking in the surroundings. This was because the sealed artifact's number was 0-01. At the top of Byam's remaining bell tower, the light on Amon's monocle gradually faded, returning to normal. Mr. Error hadn't held back from showcasing his new beyonder powers, doing so to make a statement to all the existences watching him. He had already accommodated Door's uniqueness and obtained the corresponding authority. He had used this opportunity to shut off everything related to the concept of a door in the entire world, greatly strengthening the effects of any seals. This caused the Orthodox churches and secret organizations to be unable to use sealed items for a short period of time because no one could remove the seal. Even if a true deity descended from the astral world, it would still take them a certain amount of time before they could break the restrictions. Therefore, Amon eliminated most Grade 0 sealed artifacts in the subsequent Battle of Gods. He no longer needed to consider the corresponding interference. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Of course, such authority wouldn't be able to influence the entire world for too long unless Mr. Error had put all his energy into this matter. It was precisely because of this that he didn't do it ahead of time. Only when he observed the disturbance in Klein's anchors did he suddenly act. The more powerful a Grade 0 sealed artifact was, the more terrifying the negative effects would be. It was even more so for those that could produce effects at the level of a deity. Even a sequence 0 true deity might not be able to withstand it for too long. Therefore, true deities wouldn't unseal them unless it was necessary, otherwise, this would bring about an even greater disturbance to them, causing them to suffer a net loss. After doing this, Amon held up his palm and gently leaped up. Without the bearing of a true god, he sat on the railing at the top of the bell tower. As he gazed at the horizon out into the sea, he leisurely waited for the concealment to be removed. That was when Klein's ritual to accommodate the fool's uniqueness officially began. When that happened, he would strike the death knell for him. In the concealed world of the Evernight goddess, under the repeated impact of the awakening of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and Antigonus's self-awareness and mental imprint, Klein's consciousness was like a sailboat in a storm. It would sometimes be thrown high while being struck down. At times, it would suffer corrosion, and at other times be slammed to the side. This made his thoughts turn extremely chaotic. He was about to split into two different personalities, known as Antigonus and the Lord of the Mysteries. At the same time, his avatar also lost its rationality. It was in a state of being about to collapse into a whirlpool of maggots. Only the marionette remained standing there in a daze due to the lack of any control. The prayers from the believers resounded in Klein's ears, forming a corresponding image of what he knew. This was like a dam that was resisting a surging flood. Klein wasn't too unfamiliar with such a situation. He had a similar experience after becoming an attendant of mysteries and swallowing Zaratl's Beyonder characteristic. Therefore, with the help of his anchors, he managed to survive the initial chaos. With great familiarity, he directed the self-awareness and mental imprint of Antigonus towards the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. This caused both parties to corrode each other and be occupied with each other. The mind storm weakened a lot, finally giving Klein's self-consciousness a breather. Before he could calm down, he immediately directed the image of him as a god formed by many anchors into the two mental corruptions struggle and tried to find a new balance. However, this didn't go smoothly. Compared to before, the essence of Antigonus's mental imprint, resilience, and madness were clearly stronger than Zaratl's. After all, this was a king of angels that had accommodated the uniqueness and was known as the half-fool. Furthermore, Klein had also stolen the other party's identity and fate. This brought about two other negative effects. His personality was constantly on the edge of dissociating. From time to time, he would think that he was Antigonus, attempting to fuse his mental imprint with his own mind. Having accepted the fate of Antigonus's loss of control, his entire body was collapsing uncontrollably. This brought about even more mental corruption. In addition, Antigonus's mental imprint and the awakened will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings wasn't completely incompatible. In some aspects of their battle, they showed signs of fusing together. It was as if they originated from the same existence. This gave Klein preliminary confirmation. As a natural mythical creature, Antigonus was born with some of the celestial worthy's will. When he advanced to attendant of mysteries, the problem suddenly became serious, causing him to undergo unexpected changes without him realizing it. By the time he managed to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, madness had apparently become another side of him. In other words, before completely losing control, Antigonus was already a mentally sutured monster to a certain level. His self-awareness and mental imprint were part of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and this was something that couldn't be separated by using theft. Compared to him, Zaratl's mental imprint was much cleaner. There was only a small portion that belonged to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Most of it came from Zaratl's intense emotions at his deathbed. The reason why the two were different was that, apart from the fact that Antigonus had accommodated the fool's uniqueness, the former had become the attendant of mysteries at the beginning of the fourth epoch. At that time, the will of the celestial worthy hadn't weakened to the state it was in during the late fifth epoch. Without being able to form a new balance, the speed of Klein's breakdown became faster and faster. More than half of his body was formed from transparent and distorted maggots, and he extended slippery and sinister tentacles into his surroundings. Just as he was trying his best to maintain his consciousness and not give up searching for a new balance, his collapsed body, Antigonus's crazy mental state, and the consciousness of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings all fell into a deep sleep. This caused all the changes to stop abruptly and return to normal. As for Klein's self-consciousness, he used his trait of resisting dreams and the invasion of his mind to maintain his clarity of mind. That's right. The fate that I stole includes the fate of being in a state of eternal slumber outside the fate of going crazy and losing control. As for me, I can resist eternal slumber to a certain extent. Klein grabbed the sliver of clarity and gained a certain understanding of his present state. To him, this was an opportunity. It was only at this moment that he fully understood why the Evernight goddess needed the river water of the river of eternal darkness to use as a medium to attempt this. This wasn't only because it was difficult to put a king of angels who had accommodated the uniqueness and the awakening will of the Lord of the Mysteries in him to temporarily enter a state of eternal sleep, but it was beneficial to Klein for this state of eternal slumber. This could create an excellent environment of him being the only one with a sliver of consciousness while the other interference was all sleeping. At the same time, Klein also confirmed one thing. The reason why he was able to remain clear-headed in a dream and during the instances where his mind was intruded wasn't because of the special traits from Sapphira Castle. This was because the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body was also sleeping. Although the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries was still greatly limited, his level and his connection with Sapphira Castle were undoubtedly stronger than Klein's. If he couldn't completely resist a state of eternal slumber, why could Klein? Therefore, Klein believed that this trait was likely due to the blessings of the Evernight goddess, a gift he received when he came to life. The blessings given by a true goddess who wielded the power of the dream domain, and the aura, strength, and magical powers that Sapphira Castle augmented him with had combined together to form such a special trait. It was as if a gentle song came from deep within the dream. Klein's consciousness became clearer. Without any hesitation, he immediately adjusted the sleeping imprint and corruption in his body and found a new balance. Following that, he extended slippery tentacles with strange patterns and used Sapphira Castle's powers to steal the fool's uniqueness inside Antigonus's body. Perhaps it was because he was now Antigonus. The theft this time was successful after a small number of failures. A translucent mask with the symbol of the fool flew out from Antigonus's body. The man with the thick black beard was still sleeping as though he would sleep forever. At the same time, the fog dissipated and illusory starlight shone into the hall. This ancient palace suddenly appeared in the dark and mysterious astral world, appearing at the peak of the Hornacis mountain range. The concealment had been removed, and fate began to be exchanged. At this moment in the forsaken land of the gods, on one of the mountain peaks, a shadow-like curtain appeared on the surface of a huge cross. It cracked open and a man walked out from it. He was Adam, dressed in a simple white robe with a thick blonde beard. Behind him was a thick shadow with 5 heads. This shadow had partially merged with him, but it hadn't completely become one. Adam raised his head and looked at the astral world which had been distorted from authority and symbolism. He smiled calmly and said to the shadow behind him, "They don't seem to be aware of the reason why I used visionary as the foundation this time. I've never told anyone about the results of this research." Just as he said that, he proclaimed in a solemn and deep voice, "I am one, and also infinity, the beginning and the end." His eyes suddenly turned illusory as an ocean that seemed to contain all possible colors that appeared around him. Adam then raised his hand and grabbed the silver cross pendant hanging in front of his chest. A burning but illusory sun suddenly appeared above his head. To his left, lightning, squalls, and waves formed a supercilious phantom. On his right, there was a white tower with numerous brass eyes. The authorities and symbols that Adam had envisioned entered his body one after another under the influence of the chaos sea. Finally, the shadow that clung tightly to Adam's back shrank into his body. Suddenly, the sea that contained all the colors began to rise. Adam expanded into a giant shadow that seemed capable of holding up the world. The shadow slowly walked on the water surface of the illusory, chaotic darkness. It pointed at the astral world and solemnly declared, "Let there be light." In a blink of an eye, the entire astral world lit up. There were no other secrets that could be concealed. Even portions of the astral world that connected to Earth, the entire astral world, and the invisible barrier that had been separated from the universe appeared. At that moment, giant, indescribable faces seemed to cling to the transparent, cracked barrier, silently watching the developments inside. Chapter 1376 Half a great old one inside the astral world, which was even more abstract than the spirit world, looking as though all the authorities and symbolism in the universe were included inside every object appeared. And the light that illuminated this area wasn't spread uniformly. It was mainly concentrated in a few places, stacking together, forming spots created by a prism. There were a total of 3 spots in such a state, each sealing the various illusory kingdoms. One of the kingdoms was covered in bright flowers in perpetual daylight. Another seemed to be formed from books that were opened or closed. Different figures shuttled between them as they read as a form of entertainment. One was covered in storms as lightning and thunder continued without end in the boundless ocean. In the next second, the three different kingdoms underwent a violent change. In the area with perpetual daylight, all the flowers emitted light, as if they had become burning, miniature suns. The countless miniature suns intertwined together and surged deep into the kingdom before rising into an abnormally blinding golden sun. It emitted a scorching light that could illuminate the entire world, an entire solar system. However, no matter how much energy was released by this almost real sun, or how many flares of super high-temperature flames it created, it was unable to break through the prism-like spots of light. Every destroyed layer had a new layer produced at an equal speed. In another part of the astral world, on the surface of the mysterious country formed from all kinds of books, bits of brass points of light rapidly circulated on the spot of light, forming mysterious symbols that seemed to be searching for a critical point or effective method to destroy the barrier. During this process, the faint light formed a pair of illusory eyes that directly saw the weak spots and created eyes there. Meanwhile, inside the spot of light, there was also faint light swirling in it. It repeatedly took form, changing the critical points of the structure. This made it seem as though both sides were in a contest of their calculative abilities, with neither side clinching victory. In the boundless sea that was enveloped by lightning, wind, and rain, the spot of light suddenly lit up. It brought a portion of matter and approached the limit to speed, creating a violent wave that could destroy a planet. Such a wave, and the tiny bits of light constantly struck the prism-like spot of light, turning it into countless falling specks of light. At some point in time, the spot of light began to ripple like an illusory ocean that seemed to contain all colors. It seemed to solidify the surrounding environment, causing the light spots that carried the storm to slow down uncontrollably. Then, the points of light repeated a state of acceleration and deceleration. This kept repeating, but they refused to give up. With the chaos sea as a source, Adam used himself, and the true creator as a pillar, envisioned three uniquenesses, and accommodated them into this system. Adam seemed to exceed the limitations of above the sequences and became half a great old one. He was able to forcefully suppress the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of storms, and the God of knowledge and wisdom by himself, trapping the three sequence O true gods within their respective divine kingdoms. At that moment, he seemed to return to his peak condition, becoming that ancient sun god who slew one ancient god after another. He chose the two pathways of visionary and the hanged man as his foundation for his resurrection because, apart from them having the trait of resurrecting, this was also the result of his research. This had the highest chance of becoming God Almighty. After using either one of the two pathways of visionary and the hanged man to become a true god and gaining initial control over the chaos sea, he could take back the remaining uniquenesses and sequence one beyonder characteristics. This was the easiest path to advance to the Lord of the astral world. And in this matter, there was something more special about visionary than the hanged man. When the visionary first gained control of the chaos sea and accommodated a second uniqueness and corresponding sequence one beyonder characteristic to a certain extent, he could envision the remaining fake symbolism and authority, allowing him to briefly obtain strength that transcended the sequences, giving him half a great old one's strength. However, at the end of the third epoch, the ancient sun god's plan was, after being assassinated, he would immediately revive in the giant king's court where Sasra was. He would first take back the hanged man's uniqueness and three sequence one beyonder characteristics and became a sequence O true god. Then, with the first blasphemy slate placed beside him, he would gain preliminary control over the chaos sea. With this foundation, he would allow Angel of Imagination Adam to awaken and return to his main body to form a support. After building such a system, the ancient sun god would make use of the hanged man's grazing ability and a visionary's virtual persona means to control the uniquenesses and sequence one beyonder characteristics of the sun, reader, and sailor pathways to allow himself to become infinitely close to a great old one and to maintain a minimum level of stability. He didn't directly accommodate the chaos sea and the other three pathways' uniqueness and sequence one beyonder characteristics, because he didn't want to advance to become a great old one, a pillar in that era. That would inevitably lead to the resurrection of God Almighty, causing him to lose himself. He planned on controlling the situation and materials. When the apocalypse approached, he would finish the last few steps and become a pillar with self-consciousness. And back then, he didn't plan on using visionary as a foundation because he hadn't obtained the quill of Al-Zahad. He lacked the main ingredient. When the kings of angels betrayed him, and the plan failed miserably, he decided to take advantage of the disaster to take the best path when he was revived in Adam. At this moment, Adam, who had transformed into a giant shadow, stood on the water surface of the illusory, chaotic darkness, reflecting the astral world into his eyes, making it difficult for the three true gods to break through the restrictions. Surrounding him were beams of light that constantly fell from high above with blazing tails, illuminating the entire forsaken land of the gods, making both the northern and southern continents experience midday conditions simultaneously. In Biam's remaining bell tower, Aman, who was sitting on the railing, nudged the crystal monocle. With both hands propped up, he suddenly leaped up and entered the astral world. During this process, his left hand had an ancient mottled stone slab appear at some point in time. The first blasphemy slate. Aman had once used it to seal the gap caused by Mr. Door's returning ritual to prevent the invasion of the mother goddess of depravity. After the return ritual ended, and the door of flesh and blood completely collapsed without a tunnel to maintain anymore, he retrieved the blasphemy slate. At that moment, Aman casually threw the ancient, mottled stone slate down from the astral world and allowed it to land somewhere in the fog sea. It was a mountain that tore out of the boundless black fog. There was no end to its depth. Its surroundings appeared like a continent. After the first blasphemy slate landed, it accurately stabbed into the peak of the mountain, forming an illusory sea that contained all the colors. At the same time, Aman entered the astral world and saw the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range that had been grafted here. He saw the ancient and dilapidated palace on the mountain peak. Wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, his body rapidly expanded, instantly reaching the scale of a mountain. He opened his mouth as though he was about to swallow Antigonus's magnificent but dilapidated palace. Suddenly he saw a blurry figure. This figure was wearing a long, layered black dress that was not complicated but had countless stars speckled on it. She was as big as the current Aman. A pair of huge arms covered in dark black short hair grew out from both her torso and waist, but there was a beautiful and gentle face that was covered in thin black gauze. Her eyes seemed to compress the starry night sky. It made one feel at peace, but it also made one feel an uncontrollable fear. One of her two hands held a huge scythe, and another pair held a bird-shaped, golden accessory. The remaining pair held nothing, as though she was holding an invisible object. Evernight Goddess. In the next second, Aman, who was wearing a monocle on his right eye, was quickly wiped away by an eraser like he was a sketch. The Evernight Goddess raised her two empty arms as she held up an almost invisible fog. On the surface of the fog, multiple doors of different shapes rapidly opened in different spots, but they were instantly blocked, preventing any loopholes from taking place. The Evernight Goddess floated above the peak of the Hornacis mountain range in the astral world as she focused on controlling the fog world in her hand, preventing Aman's true body from escaping. As more and more doors appeared, the opening of doors became faster and faster. This goddess was unable to deal with it alone. All she could do was raise her other two arms and raise the huge scythe. The dark black scythe rapidly turned into a corporeal coffin made of black fog. The almost invisible fog world was stuffed into the coffin, and all the movements instantly ceased. It was as though death had occurred. However, this silence only lasted for a second. On the surface of the black fog-formed coffin, a series of doors took form and opened again. As the Evernight Goddess sealed the doors, she raised her arm that held a bird-shaped, golden accessory. The orange glow of twilight fell, adding a sense of decay and extinction to the heavy black coffin. The formation and opening of the doors slowed down as both parties entered a tug-of-war. At that moment, at the foot of the Evernight goddess, the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range collapsed. It was like the apocalypse had arrived early. At the same time, python-like black tentacles extended out from somewhere in the astral world. There was an eye at the end of each tentacle, either opened or closed. Any object that was seen by them would instantly turn into grayish-white rock. And anything touched by the tentacles distorted as limbs and heads stretched out, turning into good-looking women of all sizes. As the grayish-white spread rapidly, the tentacles surged towards the ancient and dilapidated palace, rushing towards Klein, who was about to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. Primordial Demonis Cheek. Chapter 1377. Crazy ravings. Countless demonesses of varying sizes brought with them the destruction of all matter, causing the scene of the entire Hornacis mountain range to develop in the direction of turning into a huge stone sphere. This made the dilapidated walls of the ancient palace collapse rapidly, exposing Klein, who was in the middle of the hall, along with his avatar and marionette out into the middle of the astral world. Just as the python-like black tentacles were about to rush into the palace, a crimson moon rose up like a scene from the apocalypse. In the perimeter of the hall that was bathed in moonlight, a cluster of wheat instantly grew out. There were flowers, mushrooms, and trees. They intertwined with each other, layer by layer, sealing the palace that belonged to Antigonus. At that moment, the hall where Klein was in seemed to be a ruin that had been sealed in history and a forest for thousands of years, as though it had been swallowed up by nature. The python-like black tentacles with eyes on their tips were blocked by plants growing wildly. They rose up as they constantly struck the screen that originated from nature, causing the latter to collapse or peel under layer after layer of petrification effects. However, no matter whether it was the wheat, flowers, mushrooms, trees, or newborns, they quickly returned to Earth Mother's embrace and grew again. Just like that, the barriers of nature were reborn and destroyed, layer by layer, as layer after layer was reborn. This showdown entered a stalemate. Earth Mother, who controlled the moon's uniqueness, fended off Primordial Demonis Cheek. At this moment, a light that couldn't be seen by most beyonders landed from high above and crashed into the barrier of nature that used plants as a foundation. The light didn't have a physical body, as though it was formed from a flux of massive and miscellaneous information. In its illusory form, it tore through the gaps between the plants, like a torrent, heading straight for Klein, who was about to retrieve the translucent mask. Hidden Sage. At this moment, a blurry light shot out from the void, revealing picture-like projections around Klein. Some of them recorded the helplessness and misery humans felt when facing supernatural beings. Some of them used an epic-like brush to reenact the scenes of humans using their own bodies as experiments to attempt fusing with beyonder ingredients to obtain strength and save the race. Some described the unique cultures and traditions due to a black emperor, while others carried various viewpoints, books, and inventions. Some resembled the dawn of the present world, starting from the massive machinery that spewed steam, buildings that rose higher and higher, and clothes that made movement easier. The contents made the seemingly thin painting exude a heaviness. This was because they bore the inspiration and development of civilization, of human society at different stages. Back then, the god of craftsmanship didn't properly digest the sequence 1 civilization enlightener potion before advancing to sequence 0 due to various reasons. He maintained his rationality and lucidity. However, this made him have to focus more on resisting the madness and inclination towards losing control. Amongst the 7 orthodox gods, he was slightly weaker than the other existences. The reason why the Church of Steam was the weakest orthodox organization was that, apart from having the shortest history and the least heritage, its corresponding god was also not in the best of conditions. By the time Roselle raised the Industrial Revolution as the son of Steam, a member of the church, and brought with him all sorts of ideas, the god of craftsmanship took the opportunity to change his name to the god of steam and machinery, sharing in the progress of the enlightenment of civilization, and digested the corresponding potion. As a true god in a neighboring pathway, he eventually chose to stand on the orthodox deity's side after the hidden sage chose to be Klein's enemy. The terrifying flood of information crashed into the illusory pictures and rapidly expanded, attempting to crack the cage. However, the tens of thousands of years of civilizations were thick and vast. The history left behind by generations of humans that numbered hundreds of millions was so vast and magnificent. It was enough to contain the information flux of the hidden sage. When the hidden sage tried breaking through the limitations of the god of steam and machinery, in the hall of the Antigonus Hall that was sealed by layers of plants, Klein extended his slippery and strange tentacles to grab the translucent mask that represented the fool's uniqueness before moving it towards his face. Just as the mask covered Klein's face, numerous figures appeared around him. Some of them were men wearing postman uniforms. Some were ordinary birds, while others were microbes that couldn't be seen with the naked eye. There were hundreds or thousands of them. The hall that only had corpses hanging in the air suddenly became crowded. And the commonality of these figures was that they wore crystal monocles, or had a circular emblem of different colors in the same position. The avatars of Mr. Araramon. It was unknown if they had used the primordial demonis or the hidden sage's attacks to open a back door and use a loophole to secretly arrive near the target. Looking at Klein, who had just put on the translucent mask and was beginning to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, these omens revealed a smile at the same time. They opened their mouths and said words that ordinary people wouldn't be capable of understanding. These words intertwined and formed terrifying and crazy ravings. You overlooked the primordial demoness. For her, Medici, who has only recovered to sequence 1, is no threat at all. Her greatest wish right now is to immediately produce a Lord of the Mysteries and open the seal of the Western continent, allowing her to have a chance of finding the City of Calamity. It's obvious that, compared to you, I'm the better choice. You're too weak. Heh. Are you still waiting for the Mother Tree of Desire or the Mother Goddess of Depravity to provide you with help? It's useless. I placed the first blasphemy slate into the Fog Sea and placed it near the Abyss's entrance, not far from that primitive island. Also, the enhanced seal brought about by the corresponding authority of doors and half of the Lord of the Astral World's control towards the world barrier prevents any outer deity from being able to have their powers penetrate inside for a short period. And without the influence of the outer deities, the dark side of the universe and the chained god currently do not wish to interfere in the battle of gods. They would rather seize this opportunity to escape their restraints. They also wish that a Lord of the Mysteries would be born as soon as possible to help them escape from the predicament. If it wasn't for the fact that stirring them would also trigger the outer deity corruption in them, I can promise you that I would have already reached an agreement with them to deal with you together. Amon was deliberately using real information to fill up the ravings, using this to make Klein suffer the effects of a two-pronged approach. One was the mental corruption brought about by the ravings, and the other was the corresponding content that distracted him. In any case, it wasn't a waste of time to him. On the one hand, he had sufficient avatars. Each worm of time saying one word was enough for him to form many words. On the other hand, he forcefully fused the information together, making a single word represent many things. At that instant, the ravings of Amon echoed in Klein's mind like sharp blades that pierced through his psyche, tearing through his mind. Normally, Klein could use his own status to suppress the ravings that were at most at the level of a sequence 1. It wouldn't affect him, but at this moment, he was accommodating the fool's uniqueness. His mental state was in a weak and subtle balance. Under such a scene, a straw might crush the camel's back, much less so many of Amon's avatars. Furthermore, while Klein felt a sharp pain in his psyche and his self-awareness was in a mess, the sleeping mental imprint of Antigonus and the will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings showed signs of awakening. In a sense, eternal slumber was an extreme seal. The Amons, who had accommodated Door's uniqueness, could undoubtedly be able to weaken the seal or even make it lose its effectiveness. Also, the translucent mask that Klein had just worn on his face, the fool's uniqueness obtained an even stronger remnant will from the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. It was also gradually breaking free from the influence of eternal slumber, and it had a certain resonance effect with the same being in Klein's body. Without using any beyonder powers, the Amens, who had simply created a few ravings, had thrown Klein into a state of imbalance, and he was on the brink of losing control. Furthermore, all of this seemed irreversible unless there was more river water from the river of eternal darkness that allowed Antigonus's mental imprint and the even more powerful will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings to continue sleeping. But at this moment, even if there was still the river water of the river of eternal darkness, the Evernight goddess wasn't able to divert her attention. This was because she was trying her best to suppress the dual pathway true God, Amun. From this point of view, the Amens were deliberately sacrificing their true body to stall the Evernight goddess, to create an opportunity for the avatars to destroy Klein's ritual. This was a little risky, but the result looked pretty good. At that moment, Klein's pocket lit up. The light was a pale golden color like sticky syrup. It instantly enveloped the surrounding area. Illuminated by this light included Klein and his avatar, as well as the book that was suddenly thrown over by the distant marionette. 0-02, Trunsoist Brass Book. The sealed artifact extended its body in midair. As it bathed in the pale golden light, a rule suddenly appeared on the blank page. It was completely different from the repeated laws from before. Speaking is prohibited here. Amon's avatars kept opening and closing their mouths, but they could no longer make a sound. A line appeared under the previous rule an instant later. Attacking each other is prohibited here. But the Trunsoist brass book fell to the ground and spread open by Klein's feet. Under the illumination of the magic wishing lamp, it actually managed to break free from the repeated cycle from before, and it set up rules that were beneficial to Klein. With just a glance, the Amens made different responses. A portion of them adjusted their monocles, and together, they raised their right hands and gently clenched it, using the corresponding authority to strengthen the seal. On the Trunsoist brass book, a line of text before those rules gradually formed. All the following rules are ineffective. Another portion of Amens locked onto Klein, who was on the boundary of losing control. Not being able to attack him didn't mean that stealing and gifting were prohibited. Chapter 1378 Change of plans. On the different Amens' faces, the monocles in different forms emitted pure light. This was something they had stolen from the depths of the ruins of the Battle of Gods. It came from the ancient sun god's eternal daytime effect there. It could purify filthy and evil objects and awaken sleeping creatures. They gifted this to Klein. This, combined with the ability to control the strength of seals obtained from the apprentice domain's authority, was enough to break the state of eternal slumber. In that instant, the mental imprint of Antigonus and the will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in Klein's body awakened. The madness, the vastness, cruelty, bloodthirstiness, and coldness were like an invisible storm that wreaked havoc in Klein's mind. Almost at the same time, in the fool's uniqueness that he wore on his face without fully accommodating it, the powerful will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings seemed like a terrifying monster that had been sleeping in the darkness for thousands of years. It suddenly opened its eyes. The former chaos and loss of control swept over again at that instant, but Klein didn't panic. Following one of his contingency plans, he calmly used the grafting ability to guide the mental imprint of Antigonus to celestial worthy's will in the fool's uniqueness, allowing the 2,000 years of entanglement between them to collide again. Meanwhile, Klein relied on his own consciousness and the anchors from the fool and the sea god believers to balance out the celestial worthy's will contained within his beyonder characteristic, just like when he separated out the attendant of mystery's marionette. If there weren't any accidents, and if this continued, there was a chance that Klein would be able to balance between the two sides and completely accommodate the fool's uniqueness. He would enter the final stage of the ritual, but how could there be no accidents when he was surrounded by Amens? Several Amens strengthened the seal of the Trunsoist brass book and the magic wishing lamp to resist the former's rule limitations. Some Amens gave the eternal daytime to Klein, and a small number of Amens locked onto Klein and attempted a theft. They were trying to steal his lucidity. One Amon failed after another, but in the end, there were still a few Amons who succeeded. They stole away Klein's self-awareness for the next 2 seconds. Klein's thoughts blurred. Without his guidance, the Antigonus's mental imprint, the two wills of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, as well as the anchors from his believers instantly lost their balance and began to madly invade, influence, and corrupt each other. Everything became extremely chaotic, and it was as if it was developing irreversibly. Klein's body collapsed inch by inch, turning into clusters of transparent and distorted maggots as he extended even more slippery and sinister tentacles. And at this moment, the rules on the Trunsoist brass book were wiped away and began writing, "Speaking is prohibited here. Attacking each other is prohibited here." Soon after, a familiar text appeared before the two rules. All the following rules are ineffective. After the seal was strengthened, the Trunsoist brass book seemed to enter a new cycle. And the influence the genie exerted on it became rather limited. Klein's consciousness quickly regained lucidity, but the situation in his body was completely chaotic and out of control. This made him completely unable to deal with the different influences or have any hope of finding a new sense of balance. In other words, he would run down the path of losing control until he became a monster. Without any time to think, Klein initiated his final contingency plan using his instincts and experience. He instantly gave up on saving his body and no longer focused on this matter. Not only that, but Klein had also even allowed the attendant of Mystery's marionette to turn into a whirlpool of maggots and let it fuse with his body along with Zeratl's mental imprint. He wanted to mess things up. However, Amon's avatars wouldn't allow him to make any attempts. Apart from the Amons, who were fighting against the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, the rest of them began to steal once again, trying to throw Klein's thoughts into chaos again until he completely lost control. The Amon in the postman uniform succeeded, but what he stole wasn't Klein's lucidity, but a drop of fresh blood. This blood immediately seeped into Postman Amon's palm. Right on the heels of that, Postman Amon's eyes turned crimson as his stomach bulged at an unimaginable speed as it squirmed. He seemed to be pregnant with a child. He had stolen the blood blessed by the primordial moon, or in other words, the mother goddess of depravity. Klein no longer placed most of his consciousness on balancing the Antigonus's mental imprint, the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and his anchors. There was no need for him to endure it passively like before. He could barely respond to Amon's theft. He used grafting to change the target that Amon had stolen to Sapphira Castle and tampered it to the junk pile, replacing it with the blessed blood of the primordial moon. This was from Shaman King Klarman. There was no doubt that there was a certain connection between Amon's avatars. Furthermore, it was impossible for their levels to reach sequence 0. Therefore, when the postman Amon was contaminated by that drop of blood, the other Amons also showed levels of chaos. Some of their stomachs protruded as well. Some of their eyes were dyed crimson, while others had invisible babies in their arms as they walked in circles on the spot. This caused the other theft to inevitably fail. Klein seized this opportunity and used the brief moment of lucidity to stir the power of Sapphira Castle to cast a shadow over the ancient palace. This place was once again concealed. Then he ignored the mental imprint of Antigonus in his body, Zeratl's mental imprint, and the two wills of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings that was beginning to fuse together. He made the blank-faced avatar which stood nearby without having shown any breakdown to extend his hand towards his main body. Its 5 fingers quickly closed, and its wrist quickly twisted. As Klein's self-consciousness didn't resist and even took the initiative to cooperate, his avatar didn't suffer many failures before using the help from Sapphira Castle to successfully steal his own consciousness, fate, anchors, and most of his identities. The only identity he left behind in his main body was his identity related to the Fool. At the same time, he had also stolen the identity, fate, and mental imprint of the Antigonus family's ancestor, the mark of fate and spirit. This could only succeed in a few tries thanks to his self-consciousness cooperating. As the stream of light with countless distributaries appeared. Klein's avatar's face contorted as it turned into Klein Moretti, who had fused with Gehrman Sparrow's traits. He had become the main body without any Beyonder characteristics. Of course, his self-consciousness and anchors were still resisting the mental imprint of the Antigonus family's ancestor, but compared to before, this was undoubtedly much easier to deal with. Having already adapted to the identity of Antigonus, he quickly found a new balance, delaying the fate of losing control. Although this remained unavoidable, it gave him a certain amount of time for his subsequent actions. On the other side, in the spot where Klein's original body was, there was only the Fool's uniqueness, all the Beyonder characteristics from the curtain, the Beyonder characteristics that originated from Zaradul, the tiny number of Beyonder characteristics which Klein had consumed and digested previously, as well as the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, the remnant mental imprint of Zaradul, as well as the Fool's identity. And without Klein's self-consciousness, Antigonus's mental imprint, and the large number of anchors involved, Zaradul's remnant mental imprint was quickly destroyed and corroded by the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. In the next second, Klein's main body suddenly fell silent. The collapse of his body stopped. He lowered his head and stopped extending the slippery and sinister tentacles around him. He was so quiet that he appeared to have lost his soul. In such a scene, the silence was even more terrifying than madness. That frozen body seemed to be giving birth to an extremely terrifying monster. Klein didn't care about what was happening. He quickly grafted the partial connection between himself and his main body above the gray fog. Then he shifted his target and locked onto Antigonus, who was on the huge stone chair. Without receiving Amon's help, the former half-fool failed to escape from his state of eternal slumber. Klein once again reached out his right hand, stealing the remaining sequence 9 and 1 Beyonder characteristics of the other party. Although he was currently using the identity and fate of Antigonus, it was still difficult for him to complete the theft. Failure was inevitable. At that moment, outside the realm of mysteries created by Sapphira Castle, Amon regained his consciousness from the initial chaos. They raised their hands and adjusted their monocles, causing the redness in their eyes to vanish. Others looked down at their stomachs and reached out to stroke them. A second later, the bulging stomachs split open, and baby after baby with faint crimson colors appeared. These infants didn't cry, nor were they deformed. All of them took out crystal monocles from the void in smooth succession and wore them to their right eye. The number of Amons increased. He had converted the babies which were due, turning them into his avatars so as to prevent the corruption of the primordial moon from interfering with him. At this moment, Earth Mother and God of Steam and Machinery had achieved the upper hand to some extent on their respective battlefields. They could finally make use of this small advantage to interfere with the situation inside the palace. Instantly, a portion of almonds turned into plants as they bloomed or bore fruit, returning to the land. A portion of almonds became knowledge, information, and words, as they ended up imprinted into an illusory book. However, there were still some almonds who had used blink, relied on loopholes, or from using the deception of the rules to successfully avoid the influence of the two true deities. As they continued to strengthen the seal of the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, they opened a door in Klein's realm of mysteries. At the same time, the angels also noticed the changes in the astral world, but their gazes were unable to penetrate the Earth Mother's natural barrier and the God of Steam and Machinery's civilization picture. They couldn't see the interior at all. This also meant that, even if they wanted to exert influence, there was nothing they could do. Inside the realm of mysteries created by Sapphira Castle, Klein finally succeeded in stealing the Beyonder characteristics of Antigonus from Sequence 9 to Sequence 1, ones that had been digested. Due to the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence, the latter had attracted many Beyonders of the same pathway over a long span of history. While turning them into marionettes, he had also absorbed their Beyonder characteristics. Therefore, at that moment, there was still a large number of seer pathway beyonder characteristics left in Antigonus's body, including a miracle invoker beyonder characteristic. The dark points of light quickly merged into Klein's body and fused with him. As he was now Antigonus, and as all the beyonder characteristics had been digested by Antigonus, his fate of losing control didn't speed up as he maintained his previous progress. This way, Klein had once again become a sequence 1 attendant of mysteries, one who had already digested the potion, with a fate that pointed towards losing control. At this moment, his original main body raised his head, his eyes dark. However, from this glance, the present Klein's mind instantly slowed down as his body turned cold. He almost had no way of resisting it. The powerful will that he was very familiar with began to slowly rise, attempting to influence Sapphira Castle. The Lord of the Mysteries had awakened to a certain threshold in Klein's main body. The Fool had become a truly great existence that was being awakened. It matched the guess of the Tarot Club and was in conflict with true history. Before Klein's thoughts slowed down, he took the initiative to cooperate with Amon and dispelled the realm of mysteries, allowing the situation inside to interact with the outside world. He had already fooled history without any problems, just like the first plan he came up with. As for how to end it, he never had a good idea. According to the changes in the situation, the final plan he activated at this critical moment was to not leave himself any way out. He would go from accommodating the Fool's uniqueness to advancing to the true Fool. In any case, this wouldn't be worse than the previous situation. Chapter 1379 Combining Forces. The curtain that enveloped the Antigonus palace instantly vanished. An indescribable aura returned to reality, causing the entire astral world to shake. Outside the world barrier that was covered in cracks, the terrifying, indescribable faces suddenly changed. The invisible barrier began to tremble violently as if it would collapse at any moment. Every continent on the planet within experienced an earthquake. It wasn't a serious one, just rather obvious. Above the 5 seas, waves surged, as if they had encountered a sudden tidal force. Amid the noon sky, the crimson moon suddenly appeared. Its color became extremely saturated and expanded in an exaggerated manner. It was as if it had hung off the roofs of every house. Other than that, the brown planet, orange planet, scarlet planet, gold planet, and blue planet lit up at the same time, emitting light of different textures. If one looked down from the cosmos, the entire Earth appeared to be swept up by an invisible storm and trembled in place. This was a slight change brought about by the outer deities' attempt to break the barrier. The aura that floated inside the ancient palace in the astral world had made them collectively recall that terrifying existence. Agitated by this, either a result of rage or madness, all of them tried to stop his revival. Compared to them, who were blocked outside the real world, the first to react was the magic wishing lamp in the pocket of Klein's main body. The sticky pale golden light penetrated through the Amon's enhanced seal, turning into a blurry and distorted figure. It stretched out its arm and pulled the Trunsoist brass book into its palm. The rules that were written previously had all disappeared, and a new article immediately formed. Resurrection of the deceased is prohibited here. A faint grayish-white fog flashed, and a familiar text appeared in front of this rule. All the following rules are ineffective. Even though he hadn't really resurrected and had yet to absorb the Fool's uniqueness and 2 sequence 9 to sequence 1 seer pathway beyonder characteristics, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in Klein's main body could also control Sapphira Castle and use its status to direct its powers. At this moment, his existence and the fog of history had completed their interactions. Fragments of light began to distort as they merged into one, sometimes breaking apart, unable to completely form a piece of history. A sense of self-conflict appeared in that piece of history. True history clearly involved the prehistoric human soul, Klein Moretti, disguising himself as the Fool and establishing the Tarot Club. He became stronger one sequence at a time, and eventually reached the level of the true Fool. However, the present history was that Mr. Fool was a great existence that was awakening, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings from ancient times. He had finally awakened. At that moment, although the rule restriction put in effect by the genie using the Trunsoist brass book could only be effective for less than a second, it still significantly weakened the will of the Lord of the Mysteries inside Klein's main body, as though he had suffered a fatal blow. As for Earth Mother and God of Steam and Machinery, they had given up on interfering with Amon's avatars, as though they wanted this Mr. Error to have the time to deal with the awakening Lord of the Mysteries. However, they, who clearly had some power to spare, didn't attempt to affect Klein's main body, but continued suppressing the primordial Demonis and the hidden sage. The subsequent attacks and interferences from the latter two were no longer intense, as if they were waiting for an outcome. To them, the resurrection of the Lord of the Mysteries was the achieving of their goals: produce a pillar as quickly as possible, and prevent entities that had animosity towards them from becoming the Lord of the Mysteries. In addition, the pathways that they were in didn't belong to the three pathways that were controlled by the Lord of the Mysteries. Furthermore, they didn't have any feuds or conflicts of interest with the other party. Amon, who was no longer affected, immediately changed his target and focused most of his attention on Klein's main body. There was no need for any explanation. They clearly knew that this was their greatest threat. Without any hesitation, the Amons raised their right hands at the same time and gently squeezed it, seriously stealing the effects of the eternal daytime from the target. However, the Amons didn't give up influencing Klein. With their numbers, they split off a small number of members and looked at Klein, who was currently a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. Furthermore, Klein also bore the identity of Antigonus. The monocles of these Amons suddenly lit up. Using the authority related to doors, they moved Klein out of the real world and into the cosmos. In the dark and vast universe, Klein's figure appeared. Then it instantly became thin, turning into a paper figurine. The paper figurine first had its belly bloated before giving birth to a paper baby. Then it rapidly rotted into dust. Klein had used grafting and paper figurine substitutes to block the attacks of the Amons. At the same time, the other Amons had succeeded in stealing the effects of the eternal daytime from Klein's main body. However, in the next second, the effects of the eternal daytime were once again stolen back. This was the Lord of the Mysteries' control over powers from his pathway. Even though he had yet to fully revive, he had already begun this process. Amon's eyes flickered as he immediately gave up on Klein and focused on three matters. Most of them continued to steal the effects of the eternal daytime and resist the Lord of the Mysteries, while a small number of them locked onto Antigonus, who was sitting on the huge stone chair. They began to steal the other party's state of eternal slumber. In addition, all the Amons had dispelled the strengthening of seals and even weakened them. Klein, who was no longer being attacked by Amon, similarly didn't counterattack. His attention was focused on his main body. The awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries was the biggest problem. At that instant, an illusory mark appeared on Klein's glabella. It was a strange door of light that was stained with hints of bluish-black. It constantly emanated a faint grayish-white fog. Klein began to snatch control over Sapphira Castle from the Lord of the Mysteries, so that it wouldn't be so easy for him to make use of the level and power. And with the Lord of the Mysteries not fully resurrected and having yet to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness and the corresponding Beyonder characteristics, he could effectively reduce his strength, allowing his failure rate to increase significantly and for the effects to be inferior. With his addition, with his control over Sapphira Castle, the fooling received by the Trunsoist brass book immediately weakened. The chances of Amon's theft also increased. In the forsaken land of the gods, at the foot of the giant shadow formed by the ancient sun god, on the surface of the sea that was covered in all colors, words written in the most ancient language quickly appeared. The revival of the Lord of the Mysteries failed due to many interferences. With this sentence forming, as Klein fought for control over Sapphira Castle, the Amons once again stole the effects of the eternal daytime, effects that had augmented the Lord of the Mysteries. Elsewhere, They had also stolen Antigonus's state of eternal slumber. Without any hesitation, the Amans transferred the state of eternal slumber to Klein's main body and gifted it to the Lord of the Mysteries. The ancient existence's aura immediately fell silent, but it quickly rebounded. At this moment, the corresponding text appeared on the weakly sealed Trunsoist brass book. Resurrection of the deceased is prohibited here. Suddenly, the terrifying will in Klein's main body rapidly weakened, producing a strong urge to fall asleep again. However, this will was so powerful that, even after a long period of time, it was unable to completely wear it down. Under these two restrictions, it was still tenacious and slowly recovering. It also attempted to use tampering and fooling to get out of the predicament. Klein sensed that the other party was using Sapphira Castle's power, so he immediately focused and interfered. At the same time, the Evernight goddess, who was floating above the ancient palace, slightly relaxed her control over Amon's true body. She pulled back the bird-shaped, golden accessory and aimed its head downwards. Inside the bronze eye of the bird-shaped, golden accessory, illusory layers of doors surged out, allowing a drop of colorless water that had a strong aura of stillness to drop onto Klein's main body in the ancient palace. This was a drop of river water from the river of eternal darkness. While the Evernight goddess was doing this, Amon's actual body's attempt to escape by opening doors also tacitly slowed down. The drop of water plummeted at an extremely fast speed. The natural barrier formed by Earth Mother and the portrait formed by the god of steam and machinery simultaneously pulled back to give way for it. With a smack, the river water of the river of eternal darkness accurately dripped onto Klein's head and silently entered. The aura of the Lord of the Mysteries, which was slowly growing, immediately receded. It stopped its fluctuation and fell into a state of eternal slumber. However, this condition wasn't very stable, as if it could be broken at any moment. At this moment, the Evernight goddess's empty hand pulled out a gigantic sword from the void. The sword's surface was covered with orange-red light as it exuded the dawn of twilight, the aura of decay. This was the symbol of the Twilight Giant. The Evernight goddess's arm that was covered with short black fur extended, striking down with the exaggerated sword. She had always kept some energy as though prepared to deliver this moment. In the strange sound of the void shattering and decaying, the sword that was covered with the light of twilight slashed through the dome of the Antigonus Palace, causing the hanging corpses to drop to the ground. Right on the heels of that, it struck Klein's main body, which had yet to escape the state of eternal slumber. The portion of the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries rapidly vanished, and the body began to wane uncontrollably. It broke down along with the Fool's uniqueness and the two sets of Sequence 9 to 1 Beyonder characteristics in his body. They also collapsed and gathered together. Upon seeing this, Klein followed his plan without any thought. He used Sapphira Castle to pull down a quarter of the fog of history and enveloped it. Amidst the grayish-white fog, the Fool's uniqueness and the Beyonder characteristics fully converged. They frantically absorbed the fog of history around them, turning into a shapeless and dark liquid. This blob of liquid stretched out as though it was forming a strange, translucent hooded cloak or a person whose internal organs and flesh were emptied out. The Fool's potion the Amans reached out their right hands at the same time in a bid to steal the potion. Chapter 1380 A miracle. More than 1,000 Amans each committed theft. With his numbers, as long as he wasn't extremely unlucky, there would always be a few who would have succeeded. Furthermore, the Fool's potion was ownerless, so it wasn't difficult to steal. While carrying out the theft, Aman removed a particular seal on his body, allowing the apprentice and marauder Beyonder characteristics to release their powers of convergence. This was rather effective towards the Fool's potion, allowing Aman to increase his success rate to the greatest extent. However, all the Amans ultimately failed. This was because a new rule had appeared on the Trunsoist brass book: acts of theft are prohibited here. In order to deal with the awakening Lord of the Mysteries, Aman had weakened all the seals here and helped the Trunsoist brass book escape the fooling. It could now have a limited number of effective rules for a brief moment amidst its repeated cycles, but now, this had adversely affected them. Seizing this opportunity, the illusory brand between Klein's brows became more obvious. A faint grayish-white fog gathered around him, forming a thin cocoon. He activated Sapphira Castle with all his might. Together with his attendant of mysteries Beyonder characteristic, he created an extremely powerful convergence effect on the Fool's Potion. The black liquid that didn't have a fixed form seemed to be a starving beast that saw food. It immediately pounced onto Klein. It kept extending and changing like a translucent skin, wrapping Klein inside. Klein's face appeared underneath this liquid. His facial features were sometimes distinct, sometimes blurred, sometimes distorted, and sometimes blank. In the forsaken land of the gods, under the giant shadow formed by the ancient sun god, words in the most ancient of languages rapidly took form on the illusory surface of the sea that contained all possible colors. Antigonus's efforts at advancing to the Fool ultimately failed due to various reasons. The reason why this existence that once dominated the entire planet didn't use Klein Moretti's name was that he was now carrying the identity and fate of Antigonus. If the subject in the sentence had been the former name, then Klein could completely ignore it. What had Klein Moretti's failed advancement got to do with Antigonus becoming the Fool? But when the subject became Antigonus, it was like a prophecy, as if it was an arrangement that had the outcome already be decided. Such a sentence could make the situation turn very grim. If Klein didn't give up on Antigonus's identity and fate, he would be restricted by those words. If he gave up Antigonus's identity and fate, then the sequence 9 and 1 Beyonder characteristic in his body would no longer belong to him in the true sense of the word. He had never digested them before. They were Beyonder characteristics that Antigonus once controlled. At present, it had nothing to do with Klein Moretti. All he did was forcefully devour them. Under such circumstances, even if there were no other factors, just the undigested Beyonder characteristics would likely cause Klein to lose control on the spot. And consuming the Fool's Potion in such a state and completing the advancement ritual was without a doubt impossible. As the ancient sun god wrote this sentence, the eternal blazing sun, the lord of storms, and the god of knowledge and wisdom, who were situated in the astral world, sensed something. Each of them launched the most intense of counterattacks in an attempt to interfere with the other party's actions. However, even though a large portion of his energy was spent restricting the three true deities, making it rather difficult, the ancient sun god quickly completed the sentence. However, his giant shadow embodiment dimmed, as though he was unable to maintain it for too long. In the astral world, within the floating ancient palace. In the battle that pit the Earth Mother and the god of steam and machinery against the primordial demoness and hidden sage, the situation became even more intense. However, the former two were still able to divert a certain amount of strength to affect Amon's avatar, preventing them from destroying Klein's advancement ritual. The Amons were forced to blink everywhere, but some of them still turned into plants, blooming and bearing fruit before returning to the land. Others collapsed into words as they were imprinted into illusory books. Apart from that, a large number of them were strengthening the seal, limiting the Trunsoist brass book, preventing the rules it enacted from being effective, or be effective for only an instant. Under the influence of these three factors, even with Amon's numbers, it appeared to be insufficient. But even so, a small number of them managed to seize the opportunity to make crystal monocles and similar circular symbols reflect Klein's figure. In the next second, the monocles and circular symbols emitted pure light. This wasn't theft, but the act of returning things. At this moment, Amon's decision was to return an item that he had formerly stolen from Klein. It was Klein's thoughts of suicide. Back when Klein was captured by Amon and brought to the forsaken land of the gods, he had tried on many occasions to commit suicide but failed to succeed. He had such thoughts stolen by the other party. At the critical moment of his advancement, once he had the intention to commit suicide, the outcome could be imagined. At that moment, Klein, who was tightly enveloped by the Fool's Potion, felt his thoughts turn chaotic and wander. His hair spread out as he felt an extremely cold, sticky liquid slowly invade him. Then, he had the thought of committing suicide and giving up. This was a change that Klein had never expected. He had long forgotten how Amon had stolen his thoughts of committing suicide. Furthermore, he didn't expect that not only was the other party unwilling to abandon these thoughts, he had even kept them carefully. If it were any time in the past, this thought might have been strong, but Klein could still use his self-control to resist it forcefully, suppressing it until it dissipated on its own. It would be akin to dealing with nasty thoughts. But now, he was in the midst of an advancement ritual. He was being influenced by the potion, and his mind had lost its stability. He was unable to effectively suppress the thought of committing suicide. The Amons always had various strange but rather effective methods. Fortunately, Klein wasn't only Klein, but also Antigonus. What relation did Klein Moretti's thoughts of committing suicide have to do with Antigonus? With this level of knowledge from this additional identity, Klein didn't immediately give up and end his life. He pulled the Antigonus mental imprint in his body and mixed it with the idea of suicide, barely suppressing it. Under such a balance, Klein's mind and body were further corroded by the fool's potion. His thoughts were the same as when he advanced to Attendant of Mysteries, completely dispersed. But the difference was that he didn't fuse with the spirit world this time. Instead, he continued to extend, enveloping the entire planet, the entire spirit world, and part of the astral world like a gaseous body. At that moment, Klein felt that he was in the bodies of different believers, in every human's body, in every animal's body, in every living thing. Everything had godhood in them. At the same time, he was still scattered within the fog of history, scattered through fleeting time, and scattered inside the silent flow of a river of light with multiple distributaries. One was also infinity. At the level of godhood, an experience like this made Klein's thoughts wear away even further, as though all that was left was a coldness that looked down on everything. Even this coldness was dissipating slowly. It wouldn't be long before Klein completely lost himself and was led by the various mental seals in the fool's potion, becoming a true monster. This coincided with Antigonus's crazy fate, allowing the latter to accelerate. At this moment he felt something off. It was unharmonious, unnatural, and abnormal. In the fog of history, there were a small number of light fragments twisting and distorting, unable to take form. It was as if there was a fundamental conflict between them. They gradually separated, breaking out into different branches to record the different content, allowing the twisting to achieve the initial state of recovering. Being imbued into everything, Klein's mind was thrown out due to this tiny disharmonious abnormality. He found some aspect of self-awareness again. With this self-awareness as the core, he quickly gathered his scattered mind and guided the fusion process between the fool's potion and his body. But at this moment, the fate of Antigonus losing control thanks to the ancient sun god's prophecy erupted early. Klein's body collapsed once again, unable to withstand the fool's potion. Without any hesitation or having the luxury of time to hesitate, Klein immediately removed a portion of the theft, effects and returned Antigonus his identity, fate, and self-awareness, allowing him, sitting on the huge stone chair, to slowly open his eyes. The dazed Antigonus gradually regained his clarity of mind. He didn't immediately lose control, because the main reason he lost control was that the Lord of the Mysteries had awakened to a large extent. And now, the fool's uniqueness and most of the beyonder characteristics that contained a portion of the will was no longer in his body. Therefore, Antigonus could use his own will to resist the madness and try to stop the fate of losing control. The prophecy of the ancient sun god came true. Antigonus really failed to advance to sequence 0 the fool. And without his identity, the sequence 9 and sequence 1 beyonder characteristic of the seer pathway in Klein's body turned into something that he hadn't digested. This threw him to the edge of losing control immediately. The fool's potion that wrapped around his body like a cloak instantly completed the act of seeping through. The will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings was awakened once again. Give up. Leave everything to me. This time, I won't accommodate another Sapphira. I won't help you protect the living creatures you wish to protect, but I won't harm them either. It's not that I won't keep my promises, but it's just that they're too weak and not worth my attention. This place is an area that is off-limits to outer deities. The unfamiliar yet weirdly familiar ravings reverberated in Klein's heart, giving him the idea of giving up. And the thought of committing suicide that he had been suppressed by Antigonus's mental imprint previously surfaced again after the balance created by it was lost. The outcome of failing an advancement attempt was about to occur. At this moment, the Evernight goddess, who was originally powerless to slash downwards with the Twilight Sword, suddenly gave up on controlling Amon's true body. As Amon's true body leaped out, and just as the avatars waited for Klein to fail the ritual, the goddess once again dragged the exaggerated sword that was covered in orange light. This time, the target was Klein. A thought flashed through Klein's mind as he took the initiative to be controlled by the thought of committing suicide, not making any attempts to resist. With a poof, he was slashed by the symbolic sword of twilight, shattering into a rotten body of meat that seeped out beyond her characteristics. Klein died. Before the Amons took any sort of measures against him, he was killed by the Evernight goddess before the ritual failed and before he completely lost control. In the next second, the Evernight goddess wore the bird-shaped, golden accessory on her head as her body expanded and enveloped the ancient palace. She instantly erased Amon's true body, avatars, Earth Mother, primordial Demonis, god of steam and machinery, hidden sage, and Antigonus, as though they were erased by an eraser. Concealment. The ancient sun god seemed to understand what the Evernight goddess wanted to do, but having already made 2 prophecies, there was no way for him to write a 3rd sentence. As for the 3 true gods, they continued throwing what they had at him, holding him back. In the next second, a miracle happened. Klein returned from the fog of history. The uniqueness of the fool that had already belonged to him and the 3 sequence 9 to sequence 1 beyonder characteristics rapidly returned to his body. Afraid that he would be disturbed, the genie quickly made use of the Trunsoist brass book to add a rule. This place is suitable for the return of beyonder characteristics. Suddenly, Klein returned to his previous state of him drinking the fool potion. But the thing that was different from before was that, back then, his body's pillar of support belonged to the sequence 9 to sequence 1 beyonder characteristics of Antigonus, ones he hadn't digested yet. And now, the first to return to him was undoubtedly the digested sequence 9 and 1 beyonder characteristic that once belonged to him. This way, he would have a true pillar of support that could accommodate the fool's uniqueness and the remaining characteristics. Klein was in a state that was the same as when he first arrived at the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range, an attendant of mysteries who had finished digesting the potion and was capable of attempting to advance to sequence 0 the fool. By relying on his resurrection, Klein had completely overturned his state. This was the flash of inspiration he had obtained from Roselle's resurrection. Of course, the entire process was different from the resurrection of a Black Emperor. The character that Klein had arranged to kill him was the genie. He never expected that the Evernight goddess, who he hadn't discussed this with, would share such tacit understanding with him. In that instant his body split apart, turning into a thin gray fog and dark liquid. The gray fog and black liquid blended together, and the countless maggots that resembled meat tendrils sprouted on the surface. Then, they intertwined into a translucent dark-colored cloak. There was no body under the cloak, just darkness. This process was very brief. In less than 2 seconds, the Evernight goddess's concealment of so many deities was clearly unable to last that long. In an instant, a door of light traveled across the surface of the concealed world at an extremely high speed. The door suddenly opened, and Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and wearing a classic black robe, leaped out. At the same time, he saw an illusory mask with blank facial features appear under the translucent dark-colored cloak. The mask instantly outlined Klein, who had fused with Gehrman Sparrow's traits. Amon's thoughts turned chaotic as though he had his intelligence forcefully lowered. The fool was born. Chapter 1381 Authority Inside the White Tower, the headquarters of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. After Luca Brewster, who was trapped underground, completed his prayer, he focused his attention back on the seal autonomously strengthening itself. He wanted to find out exactly what was going on, to see if he could decipher the secrets hidden within and use them to invent some mystical techniques. As he proceeded down each level, checking each and every sealed artifact, Luca was taken aback and stopped in his tracks. His expression became rather confused. He was lost on whether to take his next step with his left foot or right foot. This seemed to be a very profound, esoteric question to comprehend. In the southern continent, beside a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess, Leonard picked up the cup of coffee made from local ground beans and wanted to take a sip. During this process, his thoughts wandered to the closed windows and the bright sky, trying to figure out the anomaly. However, he was unable to leave the room and was sealed here. As for old man Palazrost, he had fallen into a strange state of silence without answering his questions. Thankfully, there wasn't any additional danger. Therefore, Leonard could still sit in peace, using thoughts to replace action. After an unknown period of time, he looked down at the cup of coffee that had been placed back on the table. He frowned slightly and muttered to himself in puzzlement, "What did I want to do just now?" The Rorstad archipelago, in the concealed biome city. Having not noticed the changes in the environment, Danitz carefully fiddled with the telegraph device in his room. The Golden Dream had recently come to the Sonia Sea and stopped at a port with a telegraph office. Danitz wanted to invite them over to Biome as guests to take in the grandeur of a Lord's Oracle. If possible, he wished that the Golden Dream could use Biome as its primary harbor. This way, he could return to the ship at any time to participate in adventures and seek out treasures. At the same time, he could choose to listen to the captain's lectures. As an all-rounder, Danitz had no doubt mastered all the knowledge and techniques needed to send a telegram. At that moment, he sat in front of the machine and quickly tapped his fingers, sending out the words he had constructed. At the very beginning, his thoughts were clear and his words were proper. This left him somewhat smug. Gradually, his eyes stared straight and his hands didn't stop moving, as if he was doing it on instinct. After the telegram was sent out, Danitz exhaled, picked up a cup, and gulped down a mouthful of beer. It was quicker than I expected. Even if I lose my job in the future, I can still go to the telegraph office to get a job with a good salary, Danitz thought proudly and worriedly. He casually picked up the telegram draft and recalled the process of how he sent it out. His expression gradually turned odd. What did I send in the end? Danitz couldn't help but whisper. Apparently, he had very likely mocked the first mate, second mate, iron skin, and barrel towards the latter half of the telegram. Then he passionately confessed to the captain. I'm finished. Why would I express what's hidden in my heart? Danitz's face turned pale as he suspected that he had been controlled by the potion. The content he had written didn't actually go through his head. He hurriedly sent a telegram to indicate that the content from before had nothing to do with him. It was all a result of Anderson deliberately causing trouble. At this moment, he realized that something was amiss outside. The sky was gray and there wasn't a single cloud. In the astral world, the existences and objects that had been concealed by the Evernight goddess broke through the restrictions and returned to reality one after another. They were like Amon's actual body, looking somewhat dazed without making any immediate reaction. In addition, the Evernight goddess also paused in midair in confusion, as though she hadn't thought about her subsequent actions. However, her first instinct was to protect herself. The Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom, who had been restricted by the thick prism-like spots of light in their own kingdoms, also experienced certain changes. The intensity of their counterattacks was clearly lower, giving people a sense of self-doubt, unsure if the entity before them was an enemy. The genie abandoned the Trunsoist brass book and directly returned to the magic wishing lamp. He seemed to have fought to his limits and had no choice but to retreat into the seal. He also seemed to recall something as he subconsciously evaded. Antigonus, who had just regained his self-awareness and lucidity, was once again confused. His face was filled with question marks. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? What is happening around me? In the forsaken land of the gods, the ancient sun god's giant shadow sighed and said, "Let there be light." The light in the astral world brightened as it stabbed into the eyes of Amon's true body, avatars, primordial demonis, hidden sage, and other existences. They immediately regained their senses and made use of the time to respond differently. The flood of information suddenly dispersed and fused with the various symbols around it, instantly disappearing. The black, python-like tentacles with an eyeball on their ends retracted rapidly. No one knew where they went. Amon's true body looked at Klein, who had just advanced, and gave up the chance to exert his influence while his condition was unstable. He raised his hand and adjusted the crystal monocle on his right eye. His figure split into multiple seemingly illusory and realistic doors. The doors opened and closed at the same time, preventing any existences like the Evernight goddess from knowing where Amon's true body had gone to. After Amon's true body left, his avatars faded and disappeared in a bizarre manner. This was using a loophole, turning the act of Amon's true body leaving to being equivalent to Amon's leaving. At the same time, the giant shadow that the ancient sun god had expanded only to shrink and transform back into Adam, who carried a thick shadow on his back. Beneath the feet of this visionary, the sea that contained all colors instantly dissipated as though it had returned underground. Looking up at the astral world, Adam returned to the back of that shadow screen through a crack. The fusion between him and the true creator had just begun, and it wasn't over yet. The attempt to raise himself to the level of half a great old one was actually rather difficult and risky. This would make their progress a lot slower in the future. In the astral world, as the war subsided, the natural barrier formed by plants and the portraits of civilization faded away, along with the illusory crimson moon. The Lord of Storms, eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom first shattered the thick spots of light outside their divine kingdoms. Then, they calmed down and returned to continue blocking the world barrier's cracks. The Evernight goddess, who was floating above the ancient palace, put away the pitch-black coffin, the twilight sword, the bird-shaped, golden accessory, and her 4 arms. She cast her gaze downwards. After the translucent dark-colored cloak produced the mask, it transformed into Klein's body. Klein pressed one hand against the almost invisible mask on his face, and he placed the other at his abdomen. His back was slightly arched, as though he was suffering indescribable pain. Just as he raised his head and looked at the Evernight goddess's face that was covered with a thin black veil, a pitch-black cloak appeared outside his body. Slippery and sinister tentacles extended from beneath the cloak. After becoming the fool, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in him had undoubtedly awakened further. The crazy ravings and roars continued to echo in Klein's ears, tearing through his mind, letting him know that this was going to be his future. There was no way to kill the Lord of the Mysteries. Even if his will was slowly worn down by time, his consciousness would remain forever. He could snatch Klein's body at any moment and completely revive. If it wasn't for the fact that he had just killed the Lord of the Mysteries' will, making the awakening him weaker than what Klein expected, Klein suspected that he might not be able to survive. All he could do was watch as his body collapsed and he became another existence. Of course, he could still seek the Evernight goddess's help to give him a drop of the river of eternal darkness's river water. However, this wasn't a long-term solution. He could only delay it for some time before ultimately facing it. Relying on his own consciousness and anchors, Klein stabilized the consciousness of the celestial worthy in him. At this moment, he was unable to speak. The Evernight goddess above nodded gently and said, "What you need now is stability." With that said, her figure was wiped inch by inch as she returned to the divine kingdom in the astral world. Klein turned his head to look at the slightly dazed Antigonus. With a thought, he returned to Sapphira Castle. Sitting in the half-collapsed palace, Antigonus sat on a huge stone chair. He felt as though he had just been through a very, very long dream. Inside Sapphira Castle, Klein sat at the fool's seat and focused on stabilizing his mental state. Just like before he achieved an initial level of stability, He had no way of seeking treatment from a psychiatrist. Unless he paid a visit to Adam, it was very likely that he would go even crazier. With some stability, Klein quickly checked the authorities he obtained. It was called Fooling. Not only did it contain history, time, fate, change, and concealment, but it also included the mind domains of blind stupidity. The simplest application was to lower an enemy's intelligence. Just as Klein was about to research them further, his spiritual perception was triggered. Someone had invaded Sapphira Castle. And only when the enemy successfully invaded did Klein obtain a notification. Klein suddenly looked up and saw that the grayish-white fog had formed a door at the other end of the long mottled table. A figure wearing a pointed hat, a classic black robe, and a monocle walked out. There was a tinge of darkness in Mr. Error's eyes as his smile appeared somewhat crazy. He leisurely looked around and nudged his monocle. He said with a smile, "Are you pleasantly surprised?" Klein wanted to use Sapphira Castle to expel him, but he realized that at some point in time, Amon had gained control over Sapphira Castle. Amon cast his gaze at him, pulled out a chair and sat down, chuckling. "I released the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in my body. Him, being the owner of Sapphira Castle, makes me equivalent to being the owner of Sapphira Castle. Of course, I can enter. This is very risky. Even in the past, I didn't dare to try it before, but since you've grown to this extent, I can only take the risk. This is very exciting. I'm quite pleased with the effects." As Amon spoke, slippery and sinister tentacles appeared beneath his clothes. He took the initiative to revive part of the Lord of the Mysteries, allowing himself to enter a half-crazy state. As Amon spoke, Klein appeared to be listening, but he had actually attempted to leave Sapphira Castle. This wasn't because he wanted to give up or surrender, nor was it because he was too timid and subconsciously considered fleeing first. Instead, he believed that this was the best solution for the current situation. If he stayed in Sapphira Castle, Klein would face 3 difficult questions. Firstly, he had just advanced to the Fool and his condition was extremely unstable. He had to divert a large portion of his mental strength to suppress the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Secondly, there was no way for him to obtain the help of his allies. He could only fight alone. Thirdly, under the situation that everyone could influence Sapphira Castle, even if Klein had a deeper level of control over Sapphira Castle, he wouldn't be able to express an overwhelming advantage. He might even be disrupted in his use of Sapphira Castle because his opponent was good at making use of loopholes and creating bugs, making it difficult for him to reach the same level as him. This way, when a sequence 0 the Fool faced a half-crazed, dual pathway error and door, even if he wasn't in a scenario of facing a 100% failure rate, the chances of winning were extremely minute. And by taking the opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle, Klein could immediately obtain the help of his allies to reverse the situation between the two. If Amon were to chase after him, Klein would interfere with his return to Sapphira Castle and make him face his allies. At that time, the primordial Demonis would definitely not attack again. The ancient sun god might not be able to reproduce the power of half a great old one anytime soon. With the lead of the Evernight goddess, the 6 orthodox deities were enough to deal with Amon. Even if Amon, who was in control of all the authorities of the error and door domains, wasn't easily killed, the orthodox deities would definitely be able to weaken him and seal him. After Klein stabilized his mental state and deepened his control over Sapphira Castle, he could then kill him in a targeted manner. This process was almost irreversible, even if the ancient sun god could still produce the level, status, and strength from before. His limit appeared to be suppressing 3 orthodox deities at the same time, and this didn't include the Evernight goddess. Of course, the outer deities were undoubtedly unwilling to see the birth of a new Lord of the Mysteries. Once such a situation happened, they would definitely try their best to interfere, preventing Amon from dying. However, before the world barrier collapsed, the influence they could exert would be rather limited, and it might not be of much use. Just like before, Klein believed that the combined powers of the dark side of the universe and the chained god were inferior to the hidden sage. Even if the outer deities managed to affect the situation, Klein wouldn't suffer any losses. After all, those existences wouldn't allow Amon to kill him either. He could find a place to hide and stabilize his mental state. Once he was prepared, he could make new plans again. The foggy town of the Evernight goddess was a very good choice. If Amon didn't chase after him and remained inside Sapphira Castle, Klein could use his identity as the owner of Sapphira Castle to influence the control of all kinds of matters within at any moment, preventing Amon from doing anything in Sapphira Castle. Even if he wanted to use the Crimson Star to deal with the Tarot Club members, it would be impossible. In short, it would be extremely difficult for either of them to use Sapphira Castle well, but destroying the other party's attempts was definitely simple. Under such a stalemate, Klein had time to stabilize his mental state, deepening his control over Sapphira Castle, slowly turning the situation around. Towards the end, Amon would either flee and hide, or he would let the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings completely revive, choosing to have an internecine outcome with Klein. Therefore, although he didn't have the time to analyze the pros and cons, Klein quickly came to a conclusion. Leaving Sapphira Castle now was the best choice. However, just as his consciousness sank to the edge of Sapphira Castle, he saw a crystal monocle. This item appeared in time, crushing Klein's hopes of escaping. Did you think I'd leave such an obvious loophole? Of course, you can stop me from leaving Sapphira Castle at any time. Amon curled his index finger and pressed it against the monocle as he smiled. Behind the chair that he was sitting on, the resplendent symbol rapidly changed. At times, it was formed from symbols corresponding to parasitizing, time, and fate. At times, it was a series of doors. These two different symbols appeared one after another, making it impossible to truly be fixed. Klein didn't hear what Amon said. The moment he failed, he created a real realm of mysteries, a complete divine kingdom of the fool. Light and shadows instantly changed in front of Amon's eyes. It brought with it the disappearance of the grand palace, modeled table, and luxurious high-back chair, bringing with it an ancient castle. Amon wasn't sure what the ancient castle looked like. This was because he was standing in a corridor inside the castle. He could only sense the various changes in Sapphira Castle and see with the limited vision he had. The corridor was unusually dark and gloomy. The corridor stretched endlessly. There were silver-colored elegant candle stands spaced widely apart, each producing a dim and yellow glow. There were dark red wooden doors on both sides of the corridor that seemed to connect to different rooms. There was no sound from the rooms, making it virtually impossible to know what was hidden inside. Amon casually glanced at it and smiled with interest. Interesting. As the most powerful cryptologist, he naturally knew that this was a divine kingdom, one that couldn't be broken through with brute force. This was because every door was reassembled, with different items. He forcefully broke through them, he would trigger unknown effects. Amon didn't underestimate the abilities and intelligence of a Sequence Zero the Fool. He didn't plan on experiencing any more surprises or accidents. However, once the Divine Kingdom's rules were fixed, its owner would similarly be restricted to a certain extent. To put it simply, Klein was definitely in one of the rooms, not somewhere else. One had to bear the corresponding responsibility for the benefits obtained. You want to use this method to stall for time and stabilize your mental state? Amon whispered as though he was talking to an invisible person. Then, wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, he walked to the nearest dark red wooden door. There were no holes on the wooden door, so he couldn't see the exact situation inside. In other words, it was very difficult for Amon to know if Klein was here without opening the door. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up slightly. Amon extended his right hand and drew a long rectangular shape on the dark red wooden door. Inside the rectangle, bits of starlight emerged and turned transparent, revealing the scene in the room. With the authority of door and the ability of bug, Amon forcibly opened a window without triggering the effects. Following that, he cast his gaze into the room. There were no tables, chairs, carpets, and other furniture, but a blue sea. Indeed, this door has been connected with the sea outside, Aman said without any surprise. Once he twisted the door, he would leave Sapphira Castle and appear in the sea outside. And at that time, with Klein being wary, it was almost impossible for him to enter Sapphira Castle again, just like how Klein was unable to leave Sapphira Castle. This was the reason why Aman didn't forcibly destroy the Fool's divine kingdom but opened one door at a time. Destruction led to similar effects. The repeated effects would affect Aman again and again. Even if there were many loopholes that he could use, he wouldn't be completely immune to them. Retracting his gaze, Aman walked to the opposite room and opened a window according to the method from before. However, this time, it was pitch black inside, and he couldn't see anything. Aman raised a hand and pinched the edge of his monocle and coughed lightly. His figure instantly split into two. The number of Amans increased. The split Aman glanced at Aman, who stood in the same spot, and said, "Why aren't you seeking the thrill yourself?" As he spoke, this Aman extended his right palm and grabbed the handle of the dark red wooden door. Just as he began twisting, his expression suddenly turned blank as he sat down as though he had lost the ability to think. Fooling effect. The original Aman nodded slightly. The retarded Aman immediately collapsed and turned into a transparent worm with 12 segments. Tiny bits of Beyonder characteristics seeped out and returned to Aman's body. He relied on using the loophole to avoid the negative effects of his avatars from acting on his actual body. After all the Beyonder characteristics returned, Aman released a flame that had been stolen and burned the corpse of the Worm of Time. After doing this leisurely, he looked up and adjusted the monocle on his right eye. On the crystal monocle, countless symbols, patterns, and labels appeared. They moved quickly, interweaving, reforming, or changing as though they were making calculations. This was a combination of a cryptologist's power of decryption and the key of Star's authority on position. The two attempts Aman made were mainly to gather intelligence, grasp the rules, and prepare for cracking the secrets of the Fool's divine kingdom. Soon, the symbols, patterns, and labels formed a scene on the monocle. Behind a dark red wooden door, a few slippery tentacles extended out from Klein's body. He sat on a high-back chair and calmly watched the entrance. The corners of Aman's mouth curled up. With a flash, he appeared in the room. However, everything before his eyes suddenly collapsed. Klein with the Fool's aura quickly turned thin, turning into a card. On the card, Roselle Gustave was wearing a gorgeous head accessory and colorful clothes, holding a stick with luggage hanging from it. His eyes were filled with longing. The Fool card. The Fool card from the Cards of Blasphemy. Klein knew that relying solely on paper figurine substitutes and adding the fooling effect and grafting his true aura onto it wouldn't be able to deceive a top-notch swindler like Aman. Therefore, he used the Fool card, which had some convergence powers, as his paper figurine. Although Sapphira Castle couldn't be used again, this was Klein's home ground after all. There was his junk pile, the various items he had gathered, and the newly obtained Trunsoist brass book and the borrowed magic wishing lamp. Chapter 1383 stipulated rules. With the Klein in front of Aman turning into the Fool card, the room shrank and revealed its original appearance. It was an iron cigar case that had marks of being corroded slightly. It had fused with the aura of Sapphira Castle. Klein's figure appeared out of nowhere as the entire divine kingdom of the Fool collapsed. As the magnificent palace reappeared, he grabbed the vessel that carried the Fool card and Aman's true body and suddenly closed it. He didn't have hopes of using this item to seal Aman, who wielded the corresponding authority of the door pathway. All he wanted was to buy some time and find a chance to throw Aman out of Sapphira Castle and retrieve the initiative. But at that moment, Klein, who was wearing a black trench coat, paused. His other hand took out a crystal monocle from the void with his other hand and placed it in his right eye. Behind him, Aman, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, quickly outlined his figure. His eyes were dark and wild as he laughed. "What made you think that I didn't use an avatar?" Before he finished his sentence, Klein's figure that had been parasitized rapidly turned thin, turning into a crude paper figurine. Klein was cautious and hadn't used his true form either. He relied on a paper figurine substitute that had spirit body threads grafted. He knew very well that he would rather give up an opportunity than make mistakes when fighting Amon. Once he made a mistake, under the suppression effect of a bug, it would be very difficult for him to turn the tables. With regards to the situation of the prey turning into a paper figurine, Amon didn't seem to be surprised. All he did was raise his hand to touch the crystal monocle. At the other end of the Grand Palace, Klein, who was wearing a top hat and a trench coat, uncontrollably walked out of the fool's automatic concealment. He raised his right hand and took out a crystal monocle from the void with great difficulty, slowly moving it towards his right eye. During this process, Klein's expression was filled with resistance and rather warped, as though he couldn't control his hand. The half-crazy Amon smiled leisurely. You can use paper figurines to replace you, but so can paper figurines replace you. It being parasitized is equivalent to you being parasitized. Everything is relative, and all of them have loopholes. No beyonder power is uncrackable. They can be used in any suitable situation. He made use of the relationship of the paper figurine substitute and the main body to create a bug. Although Amon looked like he was unable to control his desire to speak due to his madness, it didn't stop him from corroding Klein with his full strength. He strengthened the parasitizing bit by bit, making Klein truly wear a monocle and become him. At that moment, Klein's body suddenly collapsed. He had taken the initiative to do so. He split into countless transparent maggots that swam in all directions. Among these worms of spirit, there were a few worms of time with 12 segments mixed in. Strictly speaking, Amon's worms of time could forcefully parasitize very tiny creatures like the worms of spirit. However, when Klein split up, he took the initiative to use his fooling authority to confuse the order of time. He fooled the few worms of time, making them split up only towards the end. Unable to find the cluster of worms of spirit, they lost their target for parasitizing. In the next second, the scene in Sapphira Castle changed again. Klein once again used the realm of mysteries powers to create a new divine kingdom for the fool. Amon instantly entered a room. This place was covered with a thick yellow carpet with a crystal chandelier hanging from it. There was a door on each wall, and it was unknown where they led to. At the same time, there were oil paintings depicting various eyes hanging from the four walls. There was no need for any special scrutiny. With just a glance, Amon knew that the four doors corresponded to different effects. The main purpose was to delay his actions and create enough time for Klein to make subsequent preparations. The corners of Mr. Error curled up slightly as he cast his gaze to the ground. He extended his right fist and stretched out his fingers. An illusory door appeared on the thick yellow carpet. The door quickly moved for a second before it became fixed in place and silently opened. However, with the opening of the illusory door, the doors around the room began to move strangely. The doors creaked and opened. Almost at the same time, in the pitch-black wilderness, in a dark tower that led to the sky, Klein was holding the magic wishing lamp and removing the effects of fooling on the Trunsoist brass book. The candlewick of the magic wishing lamp lit up as it spewed out a sticky, pale gold glow. These rays of light transformed into a distorted, blurry figure. Klein didn't consider making a wish with the genie to transfer Bernadette's wishes onto him and change the ownership of the magic wishing lamp. This was because there would only be one outcome. He would die on the spot and return from the fog of history with the miracle invoker's powers. Normally, this was a good way to escape, especially since Klein could revive several times. However, the situation this time was completely different from before. Once Klein died, it would mean that he had temporarily given up on his identity as the owner of Sapphira Castle, making this place a paradise for Amon. He could use this Sapphira without any obstruction. Under such circumstances, Amon could completely fool history, interfere with fate, and suppress Klein's resurrection, making him truly die. The ones who were most effective against a beyonder were definitely higher sequence beyonders of the same pathway. Therefore, Klein's current plan was to use the status of the genie to better use the Trunsoist brass book. If the genie didn't exert a certain influence, the rules set by the Trunsoist brass book definitely wouldn't be biased towards Klein. It would only restrict all existences other than itself. As the genie's blurry, pale gold figure took form, the Trunsoist brass book produced the sound of colliding metal and quickly flipped to the second half of the book that allowed writing. Without any gap in time, new text appeared on the brass page: "Theft is prohibited here." If Klein had the choice, the most suitable rule would be "Acts of theft are prohibited here," because the former clause was a law. It couldn't stop someone from committing theft ahead of time, and it could only deliver punishment after the act. Furthermore, punishment for first-time thieves was inevitably light, something the Amans could withstand. His idea restricted the possibility of such actions. There was no such thing as theft. However, there was no way for the Trunsoist brass book to make such a rule right now. One had to wait until the provisions were watertight enough, and that it had awakened to a certain extent before that was possible. Previously, the genie had relied on his close connection with the Trunsoist brass book, his high status, and all his strength before he could enforce similar rules. At this moment, he was already drained and unable to do such things. At present, all Klein could do was try his best to stall for time so that the Trunsoist brass book could produce a sufficiently strict setup of laws to target Amon so as to act in concert with his fooling authority. At this moment, in the room that trapped Amon, as the illusory door on the ground opened, the four real doors shook and cracks appeared. This would bring about many unknown effects. Suddenly, the sound of a bell rang out from an endless distance away. At some point in time, Amon had transformed into an ancient, mottled stone wall clock. On the wall clock, the second hand formed by the worm of time suddenly paused. As the bell reverberated, everything in the room froze strangely, including the four doors. The only exception was Amon. He had transformed back to his pointy-hatted, classic black-robed look. With a smile, he calmly raised his left hand and tightened his 5 fingers. In the next second, the strange frozen state was broken. The 4 doors that were about to open had closed again with a bang, leaving no gaps behind. Amon's figure descended and burrowed into the illusory door that wasn't closed. Just as he used this method to leave the room, he discovered that he had arrived in a pitch-black wilderness. There was a dark tower that seemed to pierce the sky in the distance. Inside the tower, the Trunsoist brass book in front of Klein had formed a second rule: deception is prohibited here. Although Amon couldn't see what was happening, it was as though he had sensed something. After all, a high-ranking person who used the rules of deception as entertainment was undoubtedly able to sense the changes in the rules. Otherwise, there was no way of accurately finding loopholes. He immediately raised his hand and adjusted the monocle stuck in his right eye. On the surface of the crystal monocle, a blinding, pure white light spewed out, illuminating the wilderness. There were no longer any concealed existences here. This was the eternal daytime that he had previously given to Klein and retrieved from Klein's main body. In such an environment, the dark tower melted inch by inch. Klein floated in midair with one hand holding the magic wishing lamp, and the other holding the staff of the stars. In front of him was the open Trunsoist brass book. Amon took the opportunity to stretch out his hand that was holding onto the monocle. From a distance, he gripped Klein's projection to his palm. Behind him, the shadow that had been dragged out by the eternal daytime seemed to become fainter as it twisted with vitality. Without a sound, Amon began stealing Klein's various beyonder powers. He didn't deliberately seek out the fooling authority. Instead, he chose to be random to increase the success rate. However, with a flash of light, what fell into his palm was only a simple paper figurine. Grafting. The shadow behind Amon's back was lashed by an invisible whip, and he was completely unharmed. He created an error, letting his shadow replace him. Following that, Aman laughed as his voice resounded in Klein's ears. "Genie, I can also promise to send you back to the cosmos. Look, I wasn't punished. This means that I'm not swindling you." Chapter 1384 Conceptualization. Upon hearing Aman's words, Klein's heart sank. Before this, he wasn't worried that Aman would collude with Genie because he was a top-notch swindler. No promises he made could be believed. As for Genie, he had encountered the former Lord of the Mysteries. He was considered a victim of such matters in a similar vein. Therefore, he would definitely use his most wary of approaches to deal with Mr. Error. This was the result of a lack of trust. Sometimes, lying, cheating, and swindling could indeed increase the profits in the short term, but in the long term, it was better to be honest. But now, the Trunsoist brass book had just formulated the rule of deception is prohibited here. And Aman didn't receive any punishment after making the promise. At the same time, Klein and Genie didn't notice him using any loopholes. This proved how true and effective Aman's words were. It was from the bottom of his heart and wasn't a scam. Genie could even rely on his own level and traits to distort the sentence from "I can promise" to "I promise." It would make it impossible for Aman to go back on his word. He would suffer damage at the level of a great old one. This made Klein not help but wonder if the rule that deception is prohibited here was secretly guided by Aman or deliberately created by Genie, making any Lord of the Mysteries candidate to promise to return him to the cosmos. To Genie, he didn't suffer any losses in such a deal because Klein himself owed him a promise. If it were any other scene, Klein would still have the time to communicate with Genie and rebuild his trust. However, at this moment, Aman's threat was right before his eyes. He wouldn't give him the chance to resolve this problem. If he chose to continue to believe in Genie, Klein would be putting his life in the hands of this outer deity and be under his control. In the subsequent battle, as long as Genie was able to formulate a few rules that appeared to be fine but were biased towards Aman through the Trunsoist brass book, Klein, who was already at a great disadvantage, would rapidly lose with no way to reverse the situation. As his thoughts raced, Klein made the choice of this gamble. A translucent dark-colored cloak instantly appeared around him. His face was covered with a strange and distorted mask. The full, invisible rings rippled from his body and instantly enveloped Genie, the Trunsoist brass book, and the entire wilderness, as well as Aman. Blind stupidity, authority. Aman's monocle temporarily lost its luster, as though he had lost his vision. His gaze also turned dull. The speed of text being written on the Trunsoist brass book clearly slowed down, as though it would take 15 minutes or even hours to think up the next rule. Genie's blurry and distorted golden figure shook as it suddenly shrank back into the golden magic lamp that looked like a water flask. It was unknown if it was escaping or if it was purely an instinctual reaction. Seizing this opportunity, Klein attempted to escape Sapphira Castle as he prepared to graft something to himself. Just as his consciousness sank, the crystal monocle appeared at the edge of Sapphira Castle, blocking his path. Even though his intelligence had been reduced briefly, Aman still seemed to remember to stop Klein from leaving Sapphira Castle. His eyes quickly regained clarity as they were still dyed black. His mouth slowly opened as he laughed uncontrollably. "I've written this matter into my instinct. This is a good way to resist the effects of blind stupidity." Clearly, it had cheated the rules and lied to himself, making his instincts believe that this was what he wanted. Klein wasn't depressed. He immediately completed the grafting he had prepared long ago. In the cosmos, a giant star that emitted light and heat suddenly dimmed. In the wilderness, with the effects of eternal daylight, an orange sun with a destructive aura and a heavy feeling descended from the sky. The entire wilderness collapsed and curled up as though it was going to charge straight into the star. At the same time, everything here was ignited, including Aman. In the next second, the surrounding void began to shrink as they revolved around the real sun. Everything in the world either disintegrated or vaporized. All that was left was the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, which were still struggling to withstand the flames, barely suffering any damage. Klein, who was floating in midair, had long disappeared. He had grafted himself to that star. Of course, his grafting was only with the concept of a star, not a physical entity. Otherwise, with the Fool's obviously lower defense than most sequence OS, he would be directly swallowed by a real star and die on the spot thanks to his relatively weak body. The Fool was a very extreme deity. He had the ability to destroy a star, but he was unable to face it directly. His strengths and weaknesses were equally obvious. In addition, conceptualized objects couldn't directly affect the surrounding environment and harm the enemy. It wasn't enough to write the words immense mass, gravity, high temperatures, high heat, and fusion to create similar effects, but as Mr. Fool, Klein held the authority of fooling. He made his surroundings change according to the concept of a star. This was an intense change, and also a type of fooling. Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, was completely ignited under the illumination of the star. He began to vaporize. At this moment, his figure distorted as he was instantly dyed with resplendent starlight. He turned extremely illusory as though he had transformed into an astral door. At that moment, Amon no longer resembled a physical creature. He was closer to a collective body of the symbols like wandering, astral world tunnel, key, and door. This was the ability of a planeswalker to use the astral world to head to different planets and worlds. They were able to transform themselves into symbols, allowing them to effectively use the astral world. At Sequence O-Door's stage, the qualitative change in such powers became conceptualized. Amon transformed himself into a concept creature and avoided the damage brought by the star. A figure suddenly appeared behind him. It was Klein, who was wearing a trench coat and a top hat. Almost at the same time, Amon's thoughts slowed down a little. His spirit body threads were grabbed by Klein. Using the chaos brought by the star, Klein dispelled the combination he had with the corresponding concepts, and he secretly grafted the location of both parties and arrived behind Amon. Originally, without the concept of reassembly, the star's influence on the surroundings would immediately stop. However, Klein had fooled time, allowing the effects of the first 2 seconds to linger until now, allowing him to fool Amon. If possible, what Klein wished to do now was to deepen the control of Amon's spirit body threads and turn him into his marionette. However, he knew very well that in the present situation, the probability of success was very low. On the one hand, Amon could withstand damage and steal the spirit body threads back. On the other hand, he might be able to use the connection established between the two of them via the spirit body threads to use a bug and influence Klein and parasitize him. Before he had absolute confidence, Klein didn't want his actions to appear rash. The main goal of capturing Amon's spirit body threads was to give the other party a certain sense of sluggishness. This was a performance of the fooling authority during the stage of transforming into a marionette. And with Klein's present state, he was naturally more willing to choose such a low-level but effective method. This would be less of a burden on him, and it wouldn't seriously affect his mental stability like when he used the authority of fooling. At this moment, apart from Amon, his enemy also included the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body. Of course, Amon was the same. He didn't suppress the celestial worthy's madness, the latter would have already revived in his body. After creating a brief pause in Amon's thoughts, Klein had 3 choices. The first was to take this opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle, but he wasn't sure if Amon's instincts were still working and would still attempt to stop him from escaping. Second, it was to summon the projections of the historical void, but it wasn't of much use. The effects of an angel-level existence could do little in this battle of gods. It was possible that they couldn't withstand Amon's gaze, much less their historical projections. Even if Klein wanted to use it to transmit information, it lacked sufficient value. The other deities couldn't enter Sapphira Castle and provide help. Third, he could use this opportunity to exert a certain amount of influence on Amon's true body. Without any hesitation, Klein chose the third plan. He wanted to take the opportunity to graft Timon, Sapphira Castle, and the Door of Light that was stained with bluish-black together. Klein felt that Amon's half-crazy state wasn't bad enough. He just appeared rather talkative, with him occasionally not grasping an opportunity. He wanted to make him go crazier. When Amon and Sapphira Castle completed the reassembly, the celestial worthy's will in his body would clearly strengthen, and the chaos in his mind would intensify. That way, Amon would lack the rationality to restrain himself, making his actions more instinctive than being the result of a contemplative thinking process. To Mr. Error, who was an expert at deceit, this would be fatal. Of course, Klein could only maintain this kind of grafting for a second. Exceeding this limit might mean that he would no longer be facing Amon, but the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When the time came, the other party would definitely gladly accept the gift of Sapphira Castle. He could then fight sequence O the Fool with a Sapphira, 2 uniquenesses, and the corresponding sequence 1 beyonder characteristics. Originally, Klein could have relied on his fooling authority to reduce Amon's intelligence, but firstly, he wasn't able to use power at this level for a long time in his current state. Secondly, as a dual pathway true god, and a wielder of many authorities, the duration of the blind stupidity effect on him was rather limited. Therefore, Klein had no choice but to take the risk of grafting things in such a way. And madness would accompany Amon, doing so until he found a new balance or met the best psychiatrist. In the blink of an eye, the translucent, cold mask appeared on Klein's face once again. A strange door of light that was stained with a hint of bluish-black suffused from Amon's body. Sapphira Castle. Chapter 1385, Madness. Amon and the strange door of light were grafted together. His face grimaced as the darkness in his eyes intensified. At the same time, more slippery tentacles appeared under his classic black robe, fully showcasing the crazy feeling was completely displayed. Just as Klein was preparing to sever the connection between Amon and Sapphira Castle and make him maintain his madness, the corners of Amon's mouth curled up. It was as if he was saying, "Congratulations, you have fallen into a trap." His face was immediately covered with a translucent mask that was similar to the fool's uniqueness, but one that was even more illusory. Klein's mind tensed up, and without a second thought, he immediately used the authority of fooling, without any regard for the consequences. But before he could react, his thoughts slowed down. He was in a dazed state that he didn't know what to do. Fooling. Amon actually used the temporary reassembly between him and Sapphira Castle to escape Klein's interference and activate the power of the fool's domain. Such an action completely exceeded his instincts and was more like a meticulous trap. Amon didn't seem to be crazy enough. This true god of the error and door pathways immediately removed the grafting of himself to Sapphira Castle, allowing the mysterious door that was tainted with hints of bluish-black to quickly fade away to prevent him from being tainted further. After dealing with this latent danger, Amon raised both hands, his thumbs and index fingers touching each other to form an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, perfectly embracing Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Amon's hands suddenly parted to the side as though they were tearing something apart. This seemed to be a heavy task. With the tearing sounds of paper, the area where Klein's body was in seemed to turn into glass. Under the intense impact, countless cracks appeared as they shattered bit by bit. This was a form of regression and the destruction of space. Unable to withstand it at all, Klein's body could only turn into paper fragments that flew in the air as the surrounding void collapsed and shattered. These bits of paper were instantly swallowed up by the darkness. By the time the space collapsed, Klein's paper figurines were almost exhausted. Of course, he also relied on the level and traits of the fool to forcefully escape the effects of blind stupidity. And at this moment, Amon had already split into countless figures. Some of them were purely avatars, some were replicas on the level of symbolism, while others were left behind from constantly blinking. At that moment, the sky above Klein's head and the surrounding wilderness were occupied by Amens. They wore pointed hats and monocles, blocking every single loophole. Some of these Amens transformed into old, mottled, bluish-black wall clocks. Some of turned into pure starlight as though they were trying to create a cage. Some extended their hands, doing different levels of theft. Some of the monocles glowed as they used various items that they had stolen from the past. Some simulated various abilities, either exerting limitations, interference, or attacks. In the Marauder pathway, theft was a core skill, one of its main symbols. The difference between it and a seer's control of spirit body threads was that, as one advanced through the sequences, not only did its effects and success rate increase, it also obtained a deeper level of conceptualization. At sequence 9 to sequence 7, theft happened on items. At sequence 6, theft happened on Beyonder powers. After advancing to sequence 5, theft happened on thoughts and ideas. At sequence 4 and sequence 3, theft became life, including parasitic theft at the physical level. And at sequence 2 level, the range of theft broadened to fate, identity, self-awareness, and Beyonder characteristics. As for sequence 1, theft could temporarily happen on time, anchors, and authorities. Therefore, when an error faced a true deity, he could also use theft that had reached the level of authority. With a gong, the ancient wall clocks paused in unison. This caused the surrounding environment to freeze, causing the destroyed wilderness from the sun's blast to become extremely quiet. Even the destruction was frozen. At that moment, Klein seemed to lose his body. All that was left was a translucent dark-colored cloak and a bizarre ice-cold mask. Under the cloak and mask was rich darkness. Nothing could be seen other than the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out. In such a state, Klein seemed to escape the limitations of time. In a frozen environment, he moved like a fish. Through various cracks in reality or concept, he emerged from the encirclement of the Amens. He once again used his fooling authority. This time he fooled time. The ancient wall clocks vanished, and in the desolate wilderness that had almost completely collapsed, time returned to its normal flow. The Amens stopped their attempts, suddenly merged into one, and blinked behind Klein, preventing him from having a breather. His left palm reached out, and as he retracted it, he clenched his fingers. Around Klein, the space suddenly became shrouded in shadows, making it look like a thin fishnet veil. The fishnet veil began to twist and reassemble, as though they formed a sufficiently strong cage that trapped Klein inside. An illusory door appeared above the cage as it moved quickly without being fixed in place. However, Klein's figure suddenly appeared outside the cell, as though he had never been sealed by Amon's door authority. He had fooled history and had split his previous and future self. Hence, the one imprisoned in the cell became his historical projection. This was the scholar of Yor's powers deepening under the fooling authority. As he had relied on an advancement ritual based on fooling history, Klein's the fool powers in such a domain were stronger than when he fooled time and fate. As soon as he escaped the spatial cell, Klein immediately used the realm of mysteries to create a new divine kingdom of the fool. This was to stall for time and find a chance to stabilize his mental state. He had used the fooling authority multiple times, and the weak balance in his body was on the verge of collapsing. If he didn't stabilize his mental state as soon as possible, the will of the celestial worthy would awaken further. This was also a serious problem. At this moment, a huge crystal monocle appeared in front of him. On this monocle, layers of sparkling lights surged out and flooded him instantly. Klein's mental state suddenly stabilized, but the price was to lose all his emotions and desires. He didn't even want to resist. All he wanted was to stand there quietly and wait for the impending destruction. This was like an ordinary person being injected with a huge dose of anesthetic. At the same time, an illusory book appeared in the layers of light. The book opened, revealing a sentence. Tormented by the Lord of the Mysteries' mental corruption, Klein Moretti had always been in great pain and a state of extreme exhaustion. After the intense battle, he has finally reached his limits due to the influence of his mind. He had decided to give up and stop resisting. Behind the huge crystal monocle, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and classic black robe, quickly outlined himself like a mountain. He looked at Klein, who had given up resisting, and his dark eyes turned lighter as the corners of his lips curled up. "I stole it. How is it?" Klein raised his head to look at Mr. Error, and he tried hard to open his mouth. He said weakly, "You were pulling off a deception from the beginning?" Amon raised his hands and said with a smile, "Unfortunately, you realized it too late." He made his thumbs and index fingers touch each other, forming an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, illuminating Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Amon solemnly separated his hands, tearing apart the void where Klein and the surrounding environment relied on to live. The void was like glass, shattering into pieces like the collapse of a skyscraper. However, all the collapsing and destruction circled Klein's body without directly affecting him. He was like a small fishing boat that calmly cruised through a storm. It appeared out of place and disharmonious, as though it didn't seem to belong here. Amon raised his hand and adjusted, his monocle on his right eye, the smile on his face somewhat faded. A translucent cloak kept popping up and disappearing over the surface of Klein's body. He looked at the mountain like Amon, his eyes turning darker. "From the moment you entered Sapphira Castle and said the first word, you began your deceit." At that time, Amon said that he had taken the risk to release the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in his body, in exchange for the identity of Sapphira Castle's owner. At that moment, Amon didn't take the opportunity to continue attacking Klein. He floated in midair and looked down at Mr. Fool. Klein didn't make any attempts either. His tone was strangely calm, as though he was preparing something. "If simply releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries as will allows you to enter Sapphira Castle at the cost of being half crazy, Antigonus could have done so back then. The Annihilation demonic wolf, Phlegria, from even earlier could have done it as well. You and Mr. Dorr previously had countless opportunities. Clearly, it's impossible to invade Sapphira Castle by just making the Lord of the Mysteries awaken to a certain extent and using half-craziness in concert with error. There's no way you can find a usable bug in this matter unless you directly get him to replace you. Only when you possessed the door authority to go anywhere did you see hope. By creating a backdoor and using bugs, you could make Sapphira Castle treat you as the Lord of the Mysteries and give you the corresponding authority. Of course, this will definitely require the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries to a rather dangerous state. Without this hidden identity, you won't be able to deceive Sapphira Castle without any reason. After absorbing Door's uniqueness, you didn't immediately infiltrate Sapphira Castle to deal with me, who was even weaker back then. It was because at that time, you were unable to completely withstand the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will, with you having just advanced. I believe you've already found a relatively safer solution. If I hadn't advanced to the Fool so quickly, you would have been able to enter Sapphira Castle in the best state to resolve everything sometime later. And now, you have no choice but to bring this plan forward. There's definitely a very serious problem with you. You took the initiative to throw out the price of becoming half-crazy to, on the one hand, make me think of countermeasures in this direction so as to lay a deadly trap in key areas, and on the other hand, you also wanted to divert attention and use this opportunity to conceal other problems. You're not half mad at all." Amon quietly listened to Klein's words. Rather abnormally, he didn't interrupt him, nor did he attempt to attack. Only when Klein was done did he say with an odd expression, "You're crazy." Chapter 1386 Narrow Path. Upon hearing Amon's, "You're crazy," Klein raised his head and laughed out loud. "I just gave up according to your arrangements. It's just that it's more complete than you think." As he spoke, an illusory brand appeared on the forehead of the ice-cold and bizarre mask he was wearing. It was a strange door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness. As for Klein, he was also enveloped in something similar. Under the translucent dark-colored cloak, more and more slippery and sinister tentacles appeared. They were densely packed and extended until they occupied the nearby sky. As his dark eyes flashed, Klein looked at Amon and said with a smile, "For me, instead of you becoming the Lord of the Mysteries, wouldn't it be better if we let the past him revive?" After his mental state stabilized and he figured out the key to Amon's surprise attack, Klein's thoughts of giving up removed his resistance towards the Lord of the Mysteries' will in his body, allowing him to further revive. It was precisely because of this that he was able to control Sapphira Castle at critical moments and borrow the power of to avoid the collapse of the space created by Amon. Without waiting for Amon's response, the corners of Klein's lips curled up as he said with a smile, "After you were corrupted by Sapphira Castle and showed signs of madness, you immediately recovered and could use Sapphira Castle to create the effects of blind stupidity. After releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries' will in you, you didn't enter a half-crazy state, as there are external powers helping you. You should have an extremely key important avatar. It might even be like Pala's choice to lower his level. It's sleeping at Adam's place, and it allows a visionary like him to personally protect your mental state. As long as the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will doesn't exceed the limits of what Adam can withstand, you won't go crazy here if you don't lose control there. Therefore, your most serious problem is that you have to maintain a normal connection with that body. Once it's interfered with, your condition will be in trouble. And this connection is actually very weak under Sapphira Castle's isolation effect. You deliberately showed a half-crazed state for two reasons. Other than luring me to find an opportunity in this direction and stepping on the trap you set up, you were also hiding this fact so that I won't be able to target this aspect while engaging in a battle with you. Of course, there are plenty of problems outside these ones. After all, you aren't fully prepared. If I had discovered these problems earlier, even if I was a king of angels with the uniqueness, there's no way for me to defeat you." Amon listened quietly and raised his hand to adjust the crystal monocle in his right eye. The corners of his lips curled up as he let out a sigh with a smile. Upon seeing this, Klein smiled and shook his head. "You truly are powerful, cunning, and terrifying, truly worthy of the title of God of Deceit. If it wasn't for the fact that I had long considered what I would do when forced into a corner by you and had no other choice, I definitely would have hesitated just now. And if I hesitated slightly, I would have already died. In that case, Amon would completely control Sapphira Castle, preventing Klein from returning from the fog of history for a resurrection." Amon stared at the increasing number of sinister tentacles extending out from under Klein's dark-colored cloak. He slowly took a deep breath and said with a smile, "The Lord of the Mysteries in you is about to truly awaken." Klein's smile had a nerve-wracking feeling to it. "You can also compete with me on this point. Our next battle is very simple. It's a competition of who awakens the Lord of the Mysteries' will to a greater extent, a competition of whose control over Sapphira Castle is deeper. 50%, 70%, 90%, until we reach 100%. Then, with a bang, we explode and he returns. What do you think? Are you going to take the bet? Let's see who can't hold on any longer first. It's very thrilling, very interesting, and very suited to your preferences. It's like the roulette that's popular in FASAC. Two people, each having a revolver and a bullet inside. They take turns pulling the trigger at their temples. Whoever gives up first results in his opponent winning. And if no one gives up and persists until the end, there won't be a winner. He will be the winner." Amon's brows pricked up as he smiled without saying a word. Klein looked at him and said with a smile, "Although you've always been pursuing thrills and are known to be a risk-taker, you achieve your goals most of the time. Not only do you not lose much, you often gain a lot. And in the few failures that you do experience, you only lose some of your avatars and some items. You've never suffered any serious injuries or been placed in a desperate situation. Your every action is a product of meticulous planning. Even if you fail, you will have a way out. Does this mean that you value your life more than I imagined? You do like thrills and seek it for pleasure, but to do so regardless of the price is just an image you portray. How can a real god of deceit wager a bet with himself at stake? Of course, this is just my own guess. Perhaps it's wrong. Anyway, do you want to take the bet? Amon stroked the crystal monocle and made a TSK like Medici. You're really crazy. Klein replied with a smile. In the eyes of others, this is indeed insane. But to me, it's just a choice. Compared to you, I'm more willing to believe in the former Lord of the Mysteries. He is a true great old one, looking down on the universe from high above and treating most of the living beings as insects. This would make him distance himself from reality. Besides, I should still have time to get the genie to be my witness. I'll get the Lord of the Mysteries to promise me certain things. To him, it's very simple and worthless. Having said that, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he said, I won't lose too much, just myself. There are always some things that are more important than others. Amon maintained his smile but didn't say a word. Klein then surveyed the area and found the magic wishing lamp and Trunsoist brass book among the floating fragments of the wilderness. He immediately laughed out loud. Look, I didn't get punished. This means that I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth. In fact, the laws set up by the Trunsoist brass book had long been abolished since the divine kingdom was destroyed during the star's descent. Later on, the Amons dared to attempt to use steel, but Klein's main goal wasn't to prove anything, but to show his determination, firmness, or perhaps madness. Of course, what he said was the truth. He was indeed willing to put them into practice. Otherwise, there was no way he could hide it from Amon or exert enough pressure on him. Amon smiled and said without a hint of panic, Sounds interesting. Isn't it? Let's begin, Klein replied without hesitation as his eyes turned darker. Amon's smile froze as his palms suddenly gathered together. Beneath his classical black robe, there were also slippery and sinister tentacles. His aura changed a little as his body seemed to have a dark cloak on it. At that moment, Amon became more like the Lord of the Mysteries. However, he wasn't competing with Klein in the progression of the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries. Instead, he was using this to deceive Sapphira Castle to create a corresponding bug and creating a chance to escape. If the authority of the error were to take effect at the same level, it would often have different preconditions. First, the medium and target had to be similar enough. Second, there was a certain connection between the two. Third, there were certain logical contradictions between certain matters or objects. Fourth, some of the rules were indeed incomplete. Fifth, while not directly affecting the target, construct an erroneous environment as a divine kingdom. In this aspect, the restrictions of fooling were even fewer, but once an error satisfied the conditions, it would be difficult to defend against or terminate it. Amon now wanted to take the initiative to disguise himself and satisfy the first category. This was similar to the invasion of a virus. First, it had to make the other party believe that they were on the same side to avoid detection and then paralyze any defenses to achieve their respective goals. When a fruit looked like a strawberry, smelled like a strawberry, tasted like a strawberry, then it would basically be considered as a strawberry. But in reality, there might be an exception. At this moment, Amon's appearance resembled that of the Lord of the Mysteries. His aura was like the Lord of the Mysteries, and his powers were like the Lord of the Mysteries. His mental imprint was also similar to the Lord of the Mysteries. With the authority of an error, it would naturally make Sapphira Castle believe that he was the Lord of the Mysteries. Suddenly, Klein's damaged the Fool Divine Kingdom completely collapsed. The grand and ancient palace and the modeled table inside appeared. The grayish-white fog beneath Sapphira Castle rose and enveloped the space. The grayish-white fog split into two waves. They clashed fiercely in a particular spot, producing vortexes one after another. They tore open a gap that led to reality. The power of Sapphira Castle was at odds with itself in this second. It was as though it didn't know which Lord of the Mysteries to obey. Amon's figure immediately vanished, using Dor's authority to rush out of Sapphira Castle. Just as he touched the edge, his body paused before being sent flying backward. At the Fool's seat, The corners of Klein's lips curled up as he sat there. His glabella and the strange door of light around him became more obvious, as though they were corporeal. This released an immense convergence force that reached an unimaginable level. It was like an invisible hand that pulled Amon back. Amon's body suddenly split apart, transforming into countless selves. And in front of every Amon, an illusory astral door appeared. Silently, the astral doors opened at the same time, but in the endless darkness behind the doors, slippery and sinister tentacles appeared, blocking Amon's escape. At the tip of the tentacles, resplendent starlight lit up as they instantly enveloped the almonds. The almonds couldn't help but gather together, turning into a conceptual cluster. These concepts included but weren't limited to pointed hats, classical black robes, monocles, fate, time, keys, doors, bugs, and Trojan horses. Klein slowly stood up and smiled at the conceptualized Amon, who was now in a passive state. You can also awaken the Lord of the Mysteries as will further, but this is different from death. It'll definitely affect the body at Adam's side. A conceptualized Amon rapidly gained a physical form. He relied on the door authority to escape from his current state. The corners of his mouth curled into a smile, but he didn't respond to Klein. He seized this opportunity to use the error authority to deceive. Using an avatar outside that he had prepared ahead of time, it could be used to replace him and swap places with him. This was similar to the swapping of marionettes in the seer domain, but at this level, the principles were different. It wouldn't be affected in most situations. However, Amon still failed. He realized that his error authority had been forcefully suppressed. As Klein slowly got up, more slippery and sinister tentacles appeared around him. The smile on his face became more exaggerated. Right on the heels of that, Amon's eyes glazed over and the smile on his face froze as the crystal monocle lost its luster. At the same time, the cold, bizarre mask on Klein's face squirmed. The blind stupidity effect. In the next second, he grafted himself to a certain concept in the cosmos, and he used his authority to influence the corresponding environment. The surrounding slippery tentacles aimed at Amon, like revolvers. In Amon's eyes that were still glazed over, a supernova exploded. An unimaginable sea of scorching light surged out, shattering his monocle and drowning his body. Chapter 1387 Method behind the endless curtain of darkness. In the darkness with aqueous light ebbing gently. A young man with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face suddenly sat up as though he had experienced a nightmare. Dressed in a classic black robe, he stretched out his right hand, attempting to take out a crystal monocle from the void and wear it over his right eye. But this time, he didn't obtain anything. His right hand paused in midair for 2 seconds before he retracted it and pinched the right eye rim. At this moment, he heard a gentle but emotionless voice. To him, there's something more important than life. To you, apart from yourself, there's nothing worth caring about. When the matter develops to a point where one's life is put on the line, it would imply your loss. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up as though he wanted to smile and reply, but he ultimately didn't say anything. The voice continued, "Born as a mythical creature, your lack of normal anchors is also a problem. This makes you know what courage and sacrifice are, but it's hard for you to understand." Amon's expression changed as he stood up from the slightly glistening darkness. He looked at the human-skinned glove that was thrown to the side before but seemed to be very happy. He retracted his gaze and curled the corners of his lips. "This seems very interesting. I plan to leave this place and enter the cosmos. That place is much more exciting than the real world. Perhaps I'll understand the two things you mentioned as a result of this. That's very dangerous. Once you enter the cosmos, and before I succeed, I won't be able to provide any help. However, this will let you avoid him, at least," the calm and indifferent voice replied without any emotion. Amon didn't say another word. He raised his hand and pinched his right eye rim and vanished from the endless shadow screen. in the ancient palace above the fog. As Amon was completely obliterated under the power of a supernova, Klein couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. If he had a choice, he naturally didn't want to sacrifice himself to revive the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. He hoped to personally protect this world and seek out the meaning of life again. Of course, if he didn't have a choice, he wouldn't hesitate to awaken the celestial worthy. He was certain that he could do this, and Amon was also aware of this. Therefore, he didn't force him and only attempted to escape. In the battle just now, it had developed into a battle of courage towards the end. The one who wasn't afraid of true death would yield the absolute advantage. Clearly, Amon wasn't prepared to sacrifice himself for this matter. After heaving a sigh of relief, Klein's face under the cold and bizarre mask suddenly grimaced. Under his translucent dark-colored cloak, the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out were either hitting the ground or rising up high. It was completely out of his control. He could feel that the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body was rapidly waking up, and it seemed like he couldn't stop it. Even if Klein directly died with his will and relied on the powers of a miracle invoker to revive, he wouldn't be able to escape, as the Lord of the Mysteries also wielded the authority of miracles. At that moment, Klein recalled the words of Dark Angel Sasrer, which was also from the ancient sun god. The primordial one had awoken in my body. In the next second, at the spot where Amon's body had shattered, beams of light were pulled by a vague invisible form of gravity as they charged towards Klein. Some were worms of time with 12 rings, some were insects made of resplendent starlight, while some were just large numbers of light dots. Klein wanted to stop the Beyonder characteristics from fusing with him, but the increasingly powerful celestial worthies prevented him from succeeding. His body swelled into a balloon, and then suddenly became thin as paper. This repeated itself in an endless loop. The mask on his face became brighter and more bizarre. The slippery and evil tentacles that extended out from under his cloak increased and became more uncontrollable. One worm of time Beyonder characteristic, one key of star Beyonder characteristic, and one. Klein's mind felt like he was being devoured by an invisible monster, producing excruciating pain. Finally, a pair of eyes, which seemed to be formed from pure starlight, formed from layers of illusory doors and crystal monocles, rushed towards Klein's face, straight for the mask's eye sockets. Almost at the same time, the strange door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness appeared on Klein's body again. Sapphira Castle. At that moment, Klein, Sapphira Castle, Door's uniqueness, and Error's uniqueness all had a strong inclination to congregate. Once they fused together, the Lord of the Mysteries would completely awaken and complete his resurrection process. Klein suddenly used his right hand to cover half of his face. His entire body bent down as if he was fighting with another self. With the anchoring and image disruption from his anchors, Klein finally slowed down the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will, reducing the power of convergence by a little. The starlight eyes and the crystal monocles stopped in front of Klein's face, floating only a few centimeters in the air like planets revolving around the sun. Klein believed that he couldn't maintain this extreme imbalance for too long. Perhaps a few minutes or even dozens of seconds later, the convergence would continue without restraint, bringing about an unbearable change. This can be considered a form of fusion. Klein laughed in an unstable manner. Then he fooled the Trunsois brass book, allowing it to enter a sealed state and fly into the junk pile. Right on the heels of that, Klein left Sapphira Castle and arrived in the astral world formed from symbolism and authority. This place seemed similar to the cosmos. It was dark and vast, but in fact there were many unique aspects to it. For example, even though there was a sun-like star hanging in the distance, emitting normal light and heat, if one tried to get close to it, without getting injured, one would realize that the astral world there was like a black curtain. The sun was directly painted with pastel colors, and there were a bunch of concepts and symbols surrounding it. Furthermore, the drawing of the sun wasn't that nice, like a child without any foundation in art casually scrawled about. It was both comical and frightening. From another perspective, This might be a manifestation of the chaos and madness that underlay everything. As soon as Klein entered, he immediately sensed invisible gazes. Some of them came from areas protected by the world barrier, while others came from broader areas with obvious malice. The corners of Klein's mouth couldn't help but curl up. He suddenly turned his head and looked outside the world barrier, raising his slippery and sinister tentacles. This pair of eyes that seemed forged from starlight and the crystal monocle also moved. All of a sudden, all the attention from the cosmos shrank back. Only the hand-drawn crimson moon was left hanging there as it flashed with light. Ah! Klein laughed as he came to a dark kingdom filled with night vanilla and slumber flowers. At the same time, the Evernight goddess appeared at the borders of the divine kingdom in a layered, star-speckled dress. Her face was covered in a translucent black veil. She didn't transform into her giant form as she looked at him at eye level before raising her right hand and revealing the bird-shaped, golden accessory. At the head of the bird-shaped, golden accessory, a series of illusory doors appeared in the bronze-like eyes, allowing a drop of colorless water that had a strong aura of eternal stillness to land on Klein's cold and bizarre mask. The will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings entered a state of eternal slumber. Likewise for a majority of Klein's consciousness. All he had was a tiny bit of lucidity. Under such circumstances, he made the mask retract, and he transformed the cloak into a black windbreaker. Then, he made the crystal monocle turn into a pair of black gloves, making the eyes forged from starlight to turn into a cane inlaid with star speckles. This was only a change in appearance, but it didn't change anything in reality. Once the two items were separated from Klein, they would return to their original state. Of course, if Klein stabilized himself, he could accommodate them and change their corresponding concepts and symbols over and over again, allowing them to change their forms forever. This can't be sustained for too long. It just delays the matter for a while. The Evernight goddess gently reminded him, if the river of eternal darkness's water is used repeatedly, the Lord of the Mysteries will awaken even faster. This is because he will trigger some unknown changes and adjust his condition. Similarly, the specialness of Sapphira Castle and my blessing will gradually be erased, allowing you to enter a state of eternal slumber. It was as though Klein wasn't discussing his own matters. He smiled and nodded. Got it? The Evernight goddess said in a tone that seemed to be comforting Klein's psyche. Regarding this matter, the method Amon used and the actions he did had exceeded my expectations. He is indeed the true god of deceit. It's not that you have no chance at all in what comes next. You can first try to completely control Sapphira Castle and pull the will of the Lord of the Mysteries to enter a state of eternal slumber. In the dream, you can resist and fuse with him. I can bless you, but the most important thing is still left to you. Becoming a great old one doesn't have any rituals involved. No ritual can change the awakening of the primordial one's will, but the ancient sun god believes that the order to accommodate them can increase one's self-awareness to a certain extent, increasing the success rate of the matter. First become a sequence 0 of a pathway, then control and fuse with the Sapphira. Only then do you accommodate the other uniquenesses. That's the best order. Become a dual pathway true god and then controlling and fusing with a Sapphira is an order that isn't good or bad. Only fusing with the Sapphira at the final step will be the worst choice. Klein smiled and said, that's a good idea. As long as one wakes up, a Lord of the Mysteries will be born. This might be him, or me. Yes, after completely controlling Sapphira Castle and entering a state of eternal slumber, I should be able to weaken the seal of the Western continent, creating a weak spot that allows one to enter and exit. The Evernight goddess didn't say a word when she heard Klein's words. Klein continued smiling. This is my choice. I had anticipated this day a long time ago. I will finally face him. Chapter 1388. A sudden gathering. The Evernight goddess nodded and didn't say anything else. She reached out her palm and grabbed a corner of the void and tugged lightly. A thin layer of a night curtain gently floated down, covering Klein's body as it silently seeped in. Klein silently took in the blessings from the dream for 2 seconds. He pressed his hand to his chest and bowed. He took 2 steps back and left the astral world. The Evernight goddess stood at the borders of the divine kingdom as she watched him leave. In the next second, Klein landed in the projection of the giant king's court in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. Then, like a mon, he walked to the edge of the grayish-blue door and raised his hand to create a blue illusory door. Through the door, Klein entered the forsaken land of the gods. Following the guidance of fate, he wandered straight to the peak of a mountain range. There was a huge crucifix erected there, one covered with a faint shadow. Klein stared at the shadow for a few seconds before sighing slightly. He bent down and picked up an ancient silver mirror that was placed near the huge cross. Then, he turned around and vanished from the forsaken land of the gods. At the same time, the Worms of Spirit, who didn't need to be on duty in Sapphira Castle, informed him of Queen Mystic's current location. Klein raised his hand and took out the magic wishing lamp from the junk pile. Using the ownership connection between it and Bernadette, he used another wandering to appear on a rather hidden island where Emerald City was. Bernadette was flipping through the latest album catalog from Intis. Just as she sensed something, she saw Gehrman Sparrow hand her the magic wishing lamp. "Thank you," Klein said in a very normal voice. Bernadette pursed her lips as though she wanted to say something, but at that moment, her eyes flashed as though she had seen something and prophesied something. Hence, she silently reached out and took the magic wishing lamp. Klein then took out a metal cigar case that had signs of corrosion on its surface. "This is your payment." Even without the eye of mystery prying, Bernadette could sense that the iron cigar case was extraordinary. She could roughly guess what kind of corrosion had happened to it. However, she didn't choose to accept it because of that reason, but she suddenly felt that she had no reason to reject it. She hesitated for a moment before taking the iron cigar case. If he was still in a rather crazy state like before, Klein definitely would have smiled and said in an exaggerated manner the moment Bernadette hesitated, "This is a gift from Uncle. Take it." But now, he was only left with that last bit of lucidity. He had to put in a lot of effort to prevent himself from falling asleep and not having the impulse to act like a clown. After leaving Bernadette's Emerald City, Klein seized the opportunity to wander to Backlund, to Dr. Aaron Series' home. Will Septon, who was sitting in a pile of toys, raised his head and looked at Dwayne Dantes in front of him. His tears suddenly streamed down as he choked. "I finally feel the opportunity." He was referring to the opportunity for accommodating the Fate Pathway's uniqueness. Klein squatted down and said without any expression, "I am here to help you accommodate it. I'll steal your childhood and youth and allow you to instantly grow up. Then, by relying on a level of above the sequences but below that of a great old one, I'll forcefully help you to accommodate the die of probability. Of course, that alone won't be enough. It will require an additional fooling and use of a bug." The tears that Will Septon dripped down suddenly stopped. He muttered in astonishment, "So the two choices are actually the same." Typically speaking, the accommodation of a pathway's uniqueness required one to be naturally born with it, seek an existence at the level of a great old one to help, or rely on a simplified advancement ritual to complete it. There was no other possibility. The Snake of Fate, Will Septon, clearly wasn't born with the uniqueness, and only had the two options left to consider. His focus had been on holding a simplified ritual, which was to wait for the opportunity of fate. Who knew that this opportunity was actually when Klein was approaching the level of a great old one? In essence, it was the second method. With this in mind, the chubby child, Will Septon, cried even harder. He felt as though he had been deceived by fate. Let the life school of thought's demigod send over the die of probability. Normally, with your luck, the die of probability should be by your side. Klein ignored Will's crying. "Let's begin as soon as possible. I don't have much time left." Will stopped and looked at Klein for a moment before he said, slightly choking, "Forget it, let's wait for the next opportunity. Given your current state, it would be a huge burden for you to forcibly help me accommodate it. Perhaps you would lose control on the spot. I don't want to face the Lord of the Mysteries." "Okay, next time. I have a premonition," With that said, Will looked into Klein's eyes and said, "I have a feeling that the next opportunity will be better." Klein maintained his reverie-like expression as he said in a low voice, "Is this a prophecy?" Will Ossipton's tears flowed again. "No, it's a blessing." Klein nodded slightly, stood up, and took a step back. During this process, his figure gradually faded away and soon disappeared. He returned to Sapphira Castle and sat on the high-back chair, allowing the grayish-white fog to envelop him. After surveying the area and confirming the states of the crimson stars, Klein leaned back in his chair in exhaustion and slightly raised his right hand. This time, he didn't create the fake world again. On the two sides of the long mottled table, crimson beams of light shot out at the same time, freezing into the members of the Tarot Club, the Hanged Man, the Sun, the Hermit, the Magician, and the rest. This sudden gathering was clearly beyond Audrey's and company's expectations. It left them surprised and alarmed. Before that, although they had come to Mr. Fool's Divine Kingdom on occasions that weren't a Monday afternoon, it was all planned. They knew in advance that they would be dragged here. They would have either applied for a mini-gathering in advance, avoid the full moon ravings, or treat Mr. World with psychological problems. It could be said that, apart from the first time, this was the second time they were summoned by Mr. Fool without any warning. This made even the slowest members of the club catch the hint of uneasiness and feel the air freeze. Thinking back to the World Sparrow's visit and the words of Mr. Fool's blessed, Audrey, Alger, and Zio simultaneously had similar thoughts. Is it finally here? Audrey subconsciously turned her head and looked down at the bottom end of the long mottled table. There was no one there. Although she was already mentally prepared, Audrey couldn't help but be stunned as emotions of uncontrollable sadness surged within her. In her heart, the World Sparrow's image had long since turned from a crazy adventurer and an extremely dangerous beyonder to a person who wore a cold and tough facade but was a gentle, powerful, loving, mysterious, and lonely man who was burdened with many friends on his back. She believed that amongst the Tarot Club members, she knew the world the best apart from Mr. Star. And now, this friend seemed to have encountered some misfortune, leaving behind only an empty seat. The Tarot Club lost its first official member. Where did Klein go? Leonard suddenly felt a little flustered. In this world, he was the only one he could befriend. Previously, when Klein suddenly appeared in the southern continent and threw the gold coin into the cathedral's donation box, Leonard had already had a strange premonition. He had the feeling that Klein was about to receive the judgment of fate and was bidding farewell to the past. This was the same as the time back in Tingen when they decided to step out together and face Megos. Old Man's recent silence has been a little bizarre. Could something really have happened to Klein? With Mr. Fool's level and status, as long as there's a chance, he should be able to be saved. Leonard's heart tightened as he suddenly turned his body and cast his gaze at Mr. Fool at the top end of the long mottled table. This mighty existence was still enveloped by the grayish-white fog, preventing others from seeing his condition. At this moment, Emlyn, Katlia, and Derek also discovered Mr. World's absence. Coupled with the suddenness of this gathering, they were both shocked and puzzled. They didn't know what had happened, but their instincts told them that it wasn't a good thing. As a clairvoyant who had recently advanced, Katlia even felt that there was a certain problem with Mr. Fool. Mr. World isn't here. Zio had previously mentioned that Mr. Fool and his few blessed were about to face a major challenge, and it's very likely that they would suffer a bad fate. Furs was also somewhat alarmed, inevitably having a strong fear due to some unknown change. She had once thought that she would sigh in relief because of Mr. World's disappearance, but from the looks of it, it wasn't like that. Instead, she found her heart heavy and a little horrified. Only then did she realize that at some point in time, the world had become the pillar of support for the Tarot Club outside of Mr. Fool. It made everyone feel at ease when they saw him. Of course, some fear was unavoidable. As Justice Audrey and company turned around and looked at the top end of the long mottled table, Klein, who was already the real Fool, said in a low voice, "This is a last-minute gathering. Mr. Fool is very exhausted." Audrey, who sensed this, felt her heart tighten. She looked around and stood up as usual. After the members of the Tarot Club stood up one after another, Audrey lifted the ends of her skirt with a heavy heart and curtsied at the end of the long mottled table. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Chapter 1389 The Fool's Commission. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. The other members of the Tarot Club appeared rather solemn as they followed Miss Justice's usual greeting. After they sat down again, the Fool Klein surveyed the area and slowly said, "I will be entering a state of slumber." Upon hearing this, Alger, Audrey, Zio, and Furs felt like their speculations had finally been confirmed. Leonard, Emlyn, Derek, and the other Tarot Club members felt their hearts sink as they became increasingly flustered and filled with puzzlement. Of course, they weren't that surprised. The abnormal last-minute gathering and the abnormality of the world's absence seemed to indicate that something important had happened today. Klein maintained his last bit of clarity and said in his previous tone, "This involves a war that's at the level of above the sequences. It has something to do with the apocalypse to a certain extent." Indeed, Alger acutely caught the words, "above the sequences." He had long suspected that there was another level above sequence 0, the one occupied by the ancient sun god when he had 8 kings of angels. Now, Mr. Fool had finally confirmed his guess and resolved many of his doubts. Catlia and company also noticed the hidden message in Mr. Fool's words. Those who had similar guesses like the hanged man felt enlightened, while the ones who had never had such guesses were inevitably surprised and confused when they heard it. However, they quickly combined what they had learned from the past and came to a realization. The Fool Klein continued, "Only after you become an angel do you have the right to know the exact situation. Otherwise, just understanding it will bring corruption." This made the Tarot Club members think of the words underground and cosmos. They were momentarily unable to contain their thoughts. Klein looked at the end of the long mottled table and said, "My blessed, the world has entered a deep slumber. It's unknown when he will wake up. Then what should be done?" Leonard nearly blurted out, but he could clearly sense that Mr. Fool hadn't finished his sentence. Therefore, he forcefully held back his urge. The Fool Klein swept his gaze across him. "Next is a long-term commission for all members. Spread my name more widely, but don't clash with the Orthodox churches. When necessary, you can choose to use a more concealed method to proselytize. This will aid in my awakening. Also, spread the news of the world being my blessed, and record it in the Church's Holy Bible. Of course, do not include information that involves his personal information. Remember one sentence: the awakening of the world spells the fool's return." Klein wanted to increase his number of anchors. This might be useful in the battle with the Lord of the Mysteries in his dream. At the same time, he wanted to mold the world into a saint of the Church of the Fool, an angel beside the divine throne, so that this image could also greatly share an image with the believers and obtain his own anchors. To put it simply, Klein planned on having a believer contribute 2 sets of anchors. After all, to him, be it the fool or the world, all of them were just an identity of his. Furthermore, the image created by anchors wouldn't be uniform. They were different and wouldn't affect him. At the level of the fool, the church would spread the name of the deity, the fool's sacred emblem, and all kinds of religious teachings without any concrete images. As for the world, he had quite a number of identities, such as Gehrman Sparrow, Dwayne Dantes, and Merlin Hermes. It wouldn't fixate on a single image. The reward is the convenience you have enjoyed in the past, the responses you received, and the corresponding help given to your future prayers, the Fool Klein said without a change in tone. After I begin my slumber, I can still respond to my prayers in a certain way, but not every time. If there's something very important that needs help, pray a few more times. He could tell from Antigonus's state of eternal slumber that dreams could be projected outside. As long as the correct method was used, a sleeping deity could make use of the dream to a certain extent to respond to prayers. Regarding this situation, the members of the Tarot Club weren't stumped by it at all. On the one hand, most of them were either openly or secretly spreading the faith of the fool. On the other hand, it was very common to pray to deities without receiving a response. Mr. Fool's responses from before were considered extremely rare. They had almost never heard of anything like this happening elsewhere. To be able to receive a response through repeated prayers on important matters was better than most of the clergymen of the Orthodox churches. Yes, Mr. Fool. The Tarot Club members didn't hesitate at all as they accepted the long-term commission. Among them, Leonard was the one that answered from the bottom of his heart. He was most eager and impatient. To him, spreading the faith and biblical canon of Mr. Fool was to awaken Klein. This made him instantly find the motivation to do something else other than his usual work. At this moment, the fool Klein nodded slightly and cast his gaze at Katlia. The previous commission, to gather all the information regarding the hidden sage suddenly coming to life, is still effective. If you wish to take the risk, then go further and investigate the present state of the hidden sage. This will be very dangerous. You can reject it, and the reward is a wish. Katlia thought for a moment and said, Honorable Mr. Fool, is this related to awakening you? Is it related to surviving the apocalypse? Perhaps, perhaps not. I can't give you a definite answer right now. I just see some visions. This time, Klein didn't deliberately create a high-level persona of the fool, because he was already the fool. Also, watch over all your subordinates that are beyonders of the Earth and Moon pathway. Katlia fell silent for a moment before slowly saying, I'll accept this commission. The fool Klein cast his gaze to the other side and said to Derek, Your mission is to protect the new city of Silver and New Moon City and protect the Rorstad archipelago. The more believers I have and the safer they are, the higher the chances of me waking up. On this foundation, think about how to expand the church and spread the faith. Your payment is to become my blessed. Derek's eyes suddenly burned as he recalled the encouraging gaze he had received from the chief when he pushed open the final door of the giant king's court. He took a deep breath and said in a firm tone, Yes, Mr. Fool. Klein nodded and looked at Furs. You need to protect the Abraham family well to prevent them from suffering the temptation of the cosmos. Also, gather more information regarding the fourth epoch and figure out Mr. Door's condition at that time. Uncover some of the latent problems of the Abraham family. That's something I wish to do. Furs hesitated for a moment, but she still expressed that she would do such things even if she wasn't given the commission. The fool Klein didn't give his approval or disapproval. Instead, he said, If you're willing, you can write down biographies and stories of the world's different identities using different aliases. The reward for above is that when you have a chance of becoming a planeswalker and have to head to the cosmos, you will receive my blessings. Although Klein knew that he could use a dream to give a response to a certain extent in his sleep, he wasn't sure if he was the one who had the upper hand or the Lord of the Mysteries. Therefore, he wished to use verbal contracts of providing a reward after the completion of a mission on more important matters. When the time came, even if he was at a disadvantage, he would be able to make use of this sort of invisible promise to give an ingenious response. Planeswalker? Furs was taken aback. To be frank, she had never considered this problem before. What she was worried about was the digestion of the secret sorcerer potion and the wanderer ritual. Soon, she composed herself and said, Yes, Mr. Fool. Klein then cast his gaze at Emlyn. The besiegement of the Rose School of Thought involves preparations for the apocalypse. It's rather dangerous. Even if an angel is participating in it, you have to pay attention to your own safety. Your commission is to try your best to gather blessings, auras, and items given by the primordial moon to her believers in the Rose School of Thought. These might be more dangerous than a Grade 1 sealed artifact. At that moment, although Klein still maintained the fool's tone, there were hints that resembled a friend's warning. This made Audrey, who had stabilized her initial mental state, sense something different. Recalling what Mr. Fool had said to the other members, she sighed inwardly. Mr. Fool's humanity seems to have become richer just as he is about to enter a deep sleep. While Emlyn was slightly surprised and puzzled, Klein continued, Apart from participating in the besieging of the Rose School of Thought's mission, I hope that you can form a pharmaceutical company and perform research on how to mass-produce the medicine with magical effects. If it's mass-produced, there's no way the products can be equipped with a magical effect, Emlyn replied instinctively. The fool Klein nodded. Seek out a compromise. Your main goal is to spread my name through this pharmaceutical company. The reward will also be a wish. This isn't a matter of danger, but whether it's possible. The simplest solution is to give me 1,000 apothecary potions. I can form an apothecary factory for mass production. Emlyn mumbled inwardly before replying seriously, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein looked to the other side and said to Zio, "The apocalypse is approaching. Be it the Red Priest or the Demonist pathways, they will become active. Your mission is to rely on the official factions to investigate the whereabouts of the 3 sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics and the uniqueness of the Red Priest pathway. If there's a chance, find a clue to confirm the primordial demonist's present condition. It's very dangerous." Klein didn't mention the payment, because he had already paid for it. Zio had her wish fulfilled by holding a ritual and becoming a sequence 4 imperative mage. As for the 3 sequence 1 Conqueror Beyonder characteristics of the Red Priest pathway, Klein had previously learned that one was in the hands of the Sauron family, the former Intis royal family, the other in the hands of the Faceax Einhorn royal family, and the other was in the hands of the Loans Augustus royal family. Later, as a reward, it was given to the Demonist sect. Of course, this was only a preliminary answer. The corresponding situation could very well have changed. The Sauron family had already been in decline since Rozel's era. It might not necessarily be able to keep the Conqueror's Beyonder characteristic or corresponding sealed artifact under its control. Klein even suspected that it might have been obtained by the Iron and Blood Cross Order. The failure of the war had significantly damaged the Einhorn family. Klein didn't rule out the possibility of the death of a high-level angel or the loss of a Grade 0 sealed artifact. The location of the Conqueror Beyonder characteristic that the Augustus family gave to the Demonist sect was currently the clearest. However, Klein knew that the Red Angel evil spirit, Sauron Einhorn Medici, had been eyeing it all this time. Perhaps he had succeeded, or perhaps he was carrying out whatever plans he had. There were no clues to the corresponding Red Priest uniqueness at the moment. The last time the mysterious world knew of it was at the end of the 4th epic, during the Pale Disaster. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.